Hi guys, tonight we are wandering into a castle where the wind never quite stops whistling through the battlements. You tug your cloak tighter as you step across uneven stone floors, the chill climbing up your legs like icy fingers. You feel the dampness in the walls, and you know that without heating, you probably won't survive this night, let alone the long winter ahead. But don't worry, you're not really going to be stuck here. You're safe in your warm room, drifting into this story with me. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And, if you feel like it, tell me your location and the local time where you are listening. Now, dim the lights and let's move through the stone corridors. You picture yourself trudging past torchlit walls, hearing your own footsteps echo. The castle seems enormous at night, hollow with silence, yet humming with the distant snap of the winter wind. You turn a corner and the reality of life in such a place begins to settle on you. Those stone towers you admire from postcards or documentaries, they are not cozy cottages. They are cold, resonant drums of misery when winter grips them. It's strange to imagine kings and queens, wrapped in fur-trimmed robes by day, reduced by night to shivering humans just like the peasants outside the walls. Yet the difference is clear. While villagers piled together in single-room huts for body heat, monarchs tried to transform cavernous, drafty chambers into sanctuaries of warmth and status. You catch the smell of smoke seeping from a half-dead fireplace. The flames dance weakly, unable to fight the freezing air spilling from narrow, glassless windows. That's one fact about castles that always strikes you: the lack of true insulation. Even the thickest stone can't block the cold. It simply absorbs it. Step close to a castle wall in winter, and your palm will feel the icy bite immediately. Historians still puzzle over whether monarchs genuinely slept better than their subjects or merely pretended at luxury. Did gilded canopies and embroidered sheets make much difference when your breath fogged the air above your face? Perhaps, but they also carried symbolic weight. The royal bed was not just furniture, it was a throne laid sideways. As you wander deeper, you hear the distant creak of wood and imagine a giant bed looming in a chamber above. These weren't the modest bedsteads of modern life. They were platforms, raised high from the ground, layered with straw mattresses, feather ticks, woolen blankets, and sometimes even bear or wolf pelts. You realize the bed itself became an island of survival in a frozen stone sea. And yet, the draft never quite left. Curtains were drawn around beds, not only for privacy but to trap warmth. The rustle of heavy fabric, the muffled voices beyond, gave the bed an aura of secrecy. You might compare it to camping under layers of quilts, except the quilts were woven by royal weavers, the designs loud proclamations of wealth. Still, an odd thought tickles you. Even with silks and tapestries, the smell of damp fur, sweaty bodies, and smouldering coals must have been inescapable. Hygiene wasn't exactly a strong suit. You picture rolling over on a mattress stuffed with feathers that had long since broken into dust, sending up little clouds when you shifted your weight. The quirky detail that often goes unnoticed? Some kings travelled with entire bed frames packed up like luggage. Imagine servants lugging carved posts, canopies, and mattress rolls from one stronghold to another, all to ensure the king never had to suffer an unfamiliar pallet. The royal bed was portable power, reassembled wherever the monarch set camp. The soundscape returns to you, the faint patter of dripping water where snow has melted through a crack, the groan of timbers in the wind, the muffled bark of a dog in the courtyard below. Each noise would have been amplified at night, making sleep precarious. No double glazing, no sealed windows, no central heating, just you, a mountain of bedding, and the fragile hope that fire would keep burning till dawn. You lean against the door of the imagined chamber, feeling the iron latch cold under your fingers. The king and queen behind it are more vulnerable than you might think. Without warmth, without attendants close at hand, they would be just another pair of humans shivering in the dark. That's perhaps the greatest surprise, that all the ceremony in the world couldn't quite conquer the simple force of winter. The candle gutters in its holder, and you step back into the corridor. Your mind drifts toward the great bedchamber itself, where kings displayed their grandeur while secretly hoping to keep their toes from freezing off. The thought makes you smile faintly because beneath all the crowns and tapestries, royalty had the same problem you'd have camping out tonight without a heater. You climb the winding stair, hand brushing the rough chill of stone, and the air grows heavier as you approach the upper levels. At last, you step into a grand chamber, meant for a king, and the reality of royal sleeping arrangements begins to unfold before your eyes. The so-called Great Bedchamber was not merely a place to curl up for the night, it was a stage, an arena where power and prestige were performed under the guise of rest. The bed itself dominates the room, raised high on a carved platform, surrounded by hangings so thick they seem to drink in the flicker of torchlight. You notice how tall the posts are, stretching like miniature towers, each crowned with embroidered banners. These are not designed only for comfort. They are designed to impress, to shout to every visiting lord or foreign ambassador, "Behold the wealth of the monarch who sleeps here." And yet, the oddity strikes you. Most people never saw a king in his actual bed. The chamber stood as symbol more than reality, often used for audiences or semi-public ceremonies where the ruler received select guests while reclining against bolsters. Think of it as a medieval blend of throne room and bedroom, where the most intimate piece of furniture doubled as a public backdrop. The mainstream fact here is straightforward. Royal bedchambers were among the most carefully guarded and richly decorated rooms in castles. Their tapestries not just for warmth but for storytelling. Each panel might depict biblical scenes, mythical beasts, or dynastic triumphs, reminding everyone who entered that this monarch's bloodline carried divine sanction. But there's a curious tidbit, one that feels almost comic in the gloom. In some records, we read of kings keeping favorite hunting dogs at the foot of the bed, or even parrots squawking in gilded cages nearby. It jars with the solemn image. Imagine a royal audience interrupted by the yapping of a spaniel or the squawk of "God Save the King" from a feathered mimic. Scholars continue to debate whether the royal bedchamber was more a living space than a true bedroom. Some argue that monarchs rarely slept there, preferring smaller, cozier rooms tucked deeper within the castle's thick walls. Others believe the grandeur was too important to abandon, even if the chill kept gnawing at their bones. You sense the truth probably lies in between. The ceremonial chamber as a daily stage, and hidden chambers as nightly retreats. You feel the thickness of the air, scented faintly with beeswax polish and smoke from an underpowered fireplace. The room is too vast for such meager heat. Your breath forms mist as you step further in, and you notice the bed curtains tied back during the day, waiting to be drawn tightly once the last attendant leaves at night. The curtains are not delicate fabrics, they are heavy brocades lined with fur or wool, their weight alone reminding you that survival here was as much about brute insulation as beauty. Run your hand across the embroidered spread, and you feel the raised stitches, tiny knots of thread worked by fingers that must have ached for weeks. This is art pressed into service as bedding. Behind the glamour lies a blunt truth. The king's chamber was another fortress, one built not of stone but of fabric, feather, and ritual. You glance at the corner, where a prie-dieu small kneeling desk sits for evening prayers. The ritual of kneeling before slipping into bed was as important as drawing the curtains. Sleep was not private indulgence. It was framed as a moment of divine vulnerability. By blessing themselves before lying down, monarchs sought protection not just from chills, but from the spiritual dangers believed to lurk in the dark hours. And all the while, attendants hovered. The chamberlain, the groom of the stool, the guards outside the door. No king was ever truly alone in this space. Privacy, that modern luxury you take for granted, scarcely existed. Even the act of undressing was witnessed, recorded in daily routines. Strange, isn't it, that in a chamber built to showcase power, the very intimacy of sleep became a communal spectacle. You take one last look around. The velvet canopy droops slightly, the fire sputters low, and the echo of your steps tells you that this chamber was made for display, not coziness. Somewhere behind these walls, perhaps, the monarch kept a smaller chamber where warmth was possible. But this was the official stage, the grand declaration of royal rest, even if the reality was stiff limbs and half-frozen toes. And as you close the heavy wooden door behind you, the question lingers. Did kings ever truly sleep well here? Or was the great bedchamber simply another throne in disguise? You slip through another carved oak door, and suddenly the air feels different. The chamber before you is dominated by a massive structure that seems almost alive in the gloom. You stop short, your breath catching as you realize what you are looking at, the medieval canopy bed in all its monumental glory. It's not the sort of furniture you could ever buy at a modern store. It is more like a wooden fortress within a fortress, designed both to awe and to insulate, both to proclaim royal splendor and to keep the occupant from turning blue in the middle of the night. You step closer, and the size overwhelms you. The posts stretch up like trees, carved with vines, heraldic beasts, or saints that stare down at you with oddly knowing expressions. Above your head, the canopy spreads like a roof, heavy with fabric and tassels, embroidered in gold thread that catches the torchlight in small flickers. You imagine lying beneath it, staring upward at those patterns, half drowsy, half conscious of the weight of wealth hanging over you. Mainstream fact first. Canopy beds in medieval castles were designed for both grandeur and practicality. The canopy, supported by 4 tall posts, wasn't only decorative. It acted as a shield against drafts falling from high stone ceilings, and its thick curtains created a little cocoon of warmth. When the curtains were drawn shut, it was like building a tent inside a chamber, an enclosed space where the king and queen might finally escape the icy bite of winter air. Run your fingers along the fabric, and you sense the texture of wool, velvet, or sometimes silk if imported from far away. The weave is dense, meant to block air, not simply to look pretty. And oh, the layers inside. A mattress stuffed with straw topped with a feather bed, perhaps another layer of wool stuffing, then sheets of linen followed by blankets and fur throws. You think of it as a layer cake of warmth, each level another defense against the cold creeping in from the stone floor and the chill seeping through window shutters. But here's a quirky little tidbit. Some of these beds were so big and so elaborate that they had to be disassembled and moved in pieces when the monarch travelled. Imagine a caravan of servants hauling carved bedposts, embroidered curtains, and bundles of mattresses across muddy winter roads, just so the king could sleep in familiar comfort miles away. The bed wasn't furniture, it was an extension of the monarch's body, carried wherever he went like a snail shell. And yet, scholars remain divided on how effective all this grandeur truly was. Did these enormous canopy beds really trap enough heat to make a difference, or were they mostly symbols of power with only marginal warmth gained? Some argue the heavy curtains created microclimates that were genuinely cozy. Others suggest the sheer size of the room and the lack of insulation meant that no amount of drapery could fully conquer the cold. It's a debate that lingers, because no one today can perfectly replicate the experience of sleeping in a 15th century royal chamber with authentic fabrics, no modern radiator, and a fire that dies at 3 in the morning. You climb the step stool at the side. Yes, many beds required steps because of their height. Once on the mattress, you notice how soft and uneven it feels. Feather beds were luxurious, but they could clump, and the linen sheets beneath your fingers are rougher than modern cotton. You roll over, and the fabric curtains fall around you, muffling the sound of wind outside. It's a relief suddenly the draft that had been cutting through your cloak is silenced. The air is warmer inside this little pocket, though still tinged with the faint odor of smoke from the fireplace and the musky scent of furs. In your imagination, attendants bustle nearby. A chamberlain closes the bed curtains after ensuring the coals in a bed warmer have done their work. Perhaps a maid lays another wolf pelt across the monarch's feet. You hear the faint scrape of boots retreating, the click of the chamber door, and at last silence. That sense of enclosure is powerful. You are cocooned, not just in fabric but in ritual. Think about the symbolic weight of this. To sleep in such a structure is to announce that your body is precious, worth guarding by curtains and carvings, worth the labor of dozens who must maintain this mobile fortress of slumber. The bed is a stage, a throne lying on its side, but it is also a safe cave against the vast chill of the castle. The sensation of lying here, you realize, is one of contrast. Above, the canopy looms heavy and ornate, a reminder of responsibility and performance. Around you, the curtains trap heat, making you feel like a child huddled under blankets. Beneath, the mattress creaks softly, reminding you that no matter how grand, beds are still places where bones press into padding, where spines ache, and where restless dreams come. And you start to wonder what those dreams might have been like. Imagine drifting off to sleep with the sound of the wind howling outside stone walls, the occasional cry of a sentry, or the bark of a distant dog. Maybe your sleep is uneasy, tangled with visions of battle, politics, or treachery. In the morning, courtiers will file in to greet you, and the very same bed you shivered in all night will serve as the backdrop for diplomacy. One fact lingers in your mind. Canopy beds were often so valuable, they were listed in royal inventories alongside jewels and crowns. They were heirlooms, passed down generations, dismantled and re-erected in new castles. Some even survive in fragments in museums today, towering testaments to how seriously medieval people took the art of sleep or the illusion of it. The flicker of torchlight dims, and you're left in the near darkness of the curtained space. The air grows close, your own breath warming it little by little, and you feel that strange combination of claustrophobia and comfort. Yes, you are shielded from drafts, but you are also trapped within embroidered walls. You imagine lying here for hours, waiting for sleep to come, hearing every creak, every murmur of the castle night. And as you picture it, you realize the canopy bed is more than furniture. It is an entire ecosystem of medieval survival, part warmth, part theatre, part prison of velvet and wood. To crawl inside was to admit vulnerability. To display it was to declare majesty. That duality clings to you as you pull the imagined curtains tight, shutting out the storm, hoping to wake in daylight rather than in the eternal darkness medieval people so often feared. You shuffle further down the corridor, listening to the soft echo of your boots against the flagstones. Another chamber door looms ahead, and when you push it open, you realize immediately that this is no private sanctuary. The room is wide, low-ceilinged compared to the grand chamber you left, and filled with more than one bed. A hush of presence lingers here, as though voices once whispered late into the night. This was a shared sleeping space, and the arrangement startles your modern sense of privacy. The mainstream fact is simple. In the medieval world, royalty and nobility rarely slept alone in perfect seclusion. The great bedchamber might hold the king's massive bed, but within its orbit were smaller beds, pallets, or truckle beds for courtiers, attendants, or favored guests. Imagine trying to drift off while someone else lies a few feet away, breathing steadily or snoring like a trumpet. The idea of private bedrooms for every individual is modern. Back then, sleeping together, whether family, retainers, or servants, was not just common, it was expected. You picture it clearly now. The royal bed, massive and curtained, takes center stage. Off to the sides, narrower beds are tucked against the walls. These might hold favored knights, personal secretaries, or noble companions who needed immediate access at dawn. Servants often unrolled pallets right on the floor near the fireplace, grateful for whatever warmth they could cling to. The chamber becomes a patchwork of slumber, a quilt of bodies pressed into one drafty room. And yet, here's a quirky detail that makes you smile. In some records, visitors wrote of being startled awake when a royal dog jumped into their pallet, or when an attendant whispered gossip long past midnight. Imagine the awkwardness, half the kingdom's business being murmured between beds, like a boarding school dormitory, except the stakes were political alliances and international treaties, rather than stolen sweets. Historians continue to debate just how intimate these shared arrangements really were. Some argue that kings and queens tolerated close company every night, that the sheer cold of castles demanded group warmth. Others believe these arrangements were situational, more for times of travel or ceremonial necessity. The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. Was the royal bedchamber more like a crowded tent, or did monarchs sometimes retreat into smaller, hidden rooms when they truly needed solitude? You run your hand across one of the small wooden bed frames, noticing its simplicity compared to the massive canopy you left earlier. The planks are rougher, the bedding thinner, the sense of prestige stripped away. Yet in its own way, this smaller bed was vital. Imagine being a personal attendant, ordered to sleep within earshot so that if the king called out in the dark, you could respond instantly. The sense of vigilance never ceased. The air feels thicker here, laced with smells that are less than regal. The mingling of damp wool, smoke, and human presence creates an atmosphere both intimate and stifling. You imagine the soundscape: servants whispering until the chamberlain orders silence, the crackle of embers in the hearth, a cough from someone curled on the floor, the restless shifting of blankets. Sleep here was not silence but a communal murmur, a background hum of life within stone walls. And this communal aspect tells you something profound. Even in the royal household, the divide between ruler and subject blurred during the most vulnerable hours. To sleep in the same room is to share humanity, to acknowledge the need for warmth, companionship, and watchful protection. The bedchamber was not a fortress of solitude, it was a hive of dependence. One can't help but chuckle at how awkward it might have been. Imagine the king rolling over, muttering half-dreams, while a courtier lying a few feet away pretends not to hear. Or the queen rising to say her prayers at midnight, her ladies in waiting stirring with bleary eyes, each one part of the nightly ritual whether they liked it or not. You think of the symbolic weight again. The presence of multiple beds signaled hospitality and hierarchy. To be invited to sleep within the royal chamber was not just convenience, it was honor. You were trusted enough to be near the monarch's most intimate space. At the same time, you were also trapped, constantly available, always on display, never free of obligation. The atmosphere becomes more vivid as you imagine slipping into one of these smaller beds. The mattress is lumpy, the straw rustling beneath linen sheets. You pull a woolen blanket over your shoulders, scratchy against your skin but desperately welcome against the night air. Across the chamber, you hear the heavy curtains of the royal bed being drawn shut, creating a muffled cocoon. Outside those curtains, you are left with the hum of whispers and the draught that sneaks through shuttered windows. Quirky as it sounds, some nobles even conducted minor business while in bed. You picture a courtier, half-sitting, parchment on his knees, scribbling notes by candlelight while another dozed beside him. The line between workplace and bedroom blurred to the point of absurdity. The chamber was a round-the-clock office, a dormitory, and a sanctuary all in one. The scholarly debate grows richer the longer you think about it. Was this arrangement practical survival in drafty castles, or was it political theatre to remind everyone of their dependence on the crown? Some argue it was both, a compromise between warmth and control. For you, standing here in the ghost of this chamber, it seems undeniable. The very fabric of medieval sleep was woven with power, loyalty, and necessity. You let your imagination drift further. The night deepens, the fire dims to glowing embers, and the chamber fills with the sound of steady breathing. You lie awake, staring at the canopy's silhouette in the dark, aware that at any moment the king could speak, and every person here would leap from bed. This isn't rest in the modern sense, it's more like a state of readiness disguised as sleep. And when morning comes, the chamber will spring alive again. Servants folding blankets, courtiers straightening tunics, the monarch stretching beneath fur covers, while attendants fling the curtains wide. The intimacy of the night evaporates, leaving only ceremony and routine. Yet you can't quite forget that for a few fragile hours, royalty and subject shared the same air, the same draughts, the same uneasy dreams. You step back into the corridor, the hush of the shared chamber still in your ears. Privacy, you realize, is a luxury that even kings and queens couldn't buy. In these cold winters, in these vast stone halls, sleep was communal, survival was collective, and the night belonged not just to one bed, but to many. The next chamber you enter feels almost theatrical in its arrangement. Instead of one dominant bed with a scattering of pallets, you notice several imposing bedsteads lined along the walls, their frames solid oak, their covers rich with embroidery. It is not the cozy, shared intimacy you just left, nor the solitary grandeur of the royal canopy. This is something different. You pause, tilting your head, wondering why on earth a single royal chamber would contain multiple beds of this stature. The straightforward historical fact here is that medieval royal and noble chambers often contained more than one substantial bed, and the reason had less to do with romance and more to do with politics. In some courts, it was common for monarchs to host honored guests, powerful allies, or even rivals within the same sleeping space. A secondary bed, richly made up, was there to demonstrate hospitality, trust, and a sort of choreographed intimacy. Imagine the message it sent. You are important enough to sleep under my roof, close enough to my person that I will let you share the sanctity of my chamber. You wander past one of these secondary beds, and you see that it is not a shabby thing shoved in the corner. Its posts are carved, its linens carefully arranged, its coverlet heavy with gold thread. To be placed in this bed was no insult. It was a symbol of royal favor, an embrace into the very heart of power. You imagine ambassadors from distant kingdoms lying awake under such covers, torn between awe at the honor and anxiety at what it implied. But then comes a curious tidbit that makes you chuckle. In some households, these spare beds weren't always for living guests. They were kept made up purely for display, so that any visitor to the chamber could see that the monarch was prepared to host at a moment's notice. Like having a guest room permanently staged, except that here the guest might never arrive. The bed itself became a diplomatic prop, whispering, "Our court is generous, our hospitality boundless." And yet, scholars continue to wrestle with the interpretation of these multiple beds. Were they truly used as sleeping places for visitors? Or were they symbolic gestures, more about theatre than practical rest? Some suggest that only rarely would an outsider actually spend the night beside a monarch's chamber. Others argue it was more frequent than we imagine, a necessary step in building alliances during a world where written contracts were less binding than shared experiences. The debate lingers, unresolved, like the faint smell of incense woven into the fabric of the coverlets. You picture the scene more vividly now. The king in his great bed, curtains pulled around him like a fortress. A favored ally, reclining on a secondary bed a few yards away, not curtained, visible, vulnerable in a way that suggests trust but also surveillance. Attendants curled on pallets near the fire, all of them awake at the first sound of trouble. It is part slumber party, part political summit, part hostage negotiation disguised as hospitality. Step closer to one of the unused beds and run your hand across the embroidered sheets. They are cool, crisp linen, stiffer than modern fabric, but beautiful. The pillows are plump with goose down. Above the headboard hangs a tapestry depicting saints, or perhaps a family crest, the eyes of stitched figures staring down as if to bless or to judge the one who lies there. And then you imagine the awkwardness, the rustle of blankets, the creak of timbers, the intimate sounds of sleep, all shared between monarch and guest. The snore of an ambassador might echo embarrassingly through the chamber, while the king lay awake gritting his teeth. Or perhaps the opposite. The monarch himself snored like a sawmill, while the guest tossed and turned in sleepless misery, forced to endure in polite silence. It makes you laugh quietly to yourself, but also reflect. The medieval night was not private, nor was it silent. Every movement, every breath, was part of a communal theatre that turned even rest into performance. The sensory details return. You smell the faint odor of lavender sachets tucked into sheets to ward off pests. You hear the crackle of the fireplace fighting desperately against the drafts. You feel the uneven softness of the mattress beneath your hand, stuffed with feathers that have shifted into lumps, and above all, you sense the presence of power, not just in the people, but in the furniture itself. These beds are not passive, they are props in the play of monarchy. One curious story lingers in your mind. A chronicler once noted that a royal chamber displayed 4 beds, all magnificently draped, though no record survives of them being used. Perhaps they were meant to impress visiting dignitaries, or to suggest that the monarch's court could host dozens at a whim. You wonder if it was all bluff, lavish beds kept empty, like gilded chairs at a banquet no one attends. And still the scholars debate. Was this practical necessity places for favoured courtiers to rest or sheer symbolic staging? Was the chamber a hotel suite? Or was it a theatre where beds played the roles of generosity, security, and wealth? You linger at the foot of the royal bed again, seeing how it dwarfs the others. The hierarchy is clear. The king's canopy soars, the curtains shimmer, the embroidery blazes. The other beds are fine, yes, but never equal. The visual message is unmistakable. Hospitality exists, but supremacy never sleeps. You picture yourself slipping into one of those guest beds. The linen is stiff, the air cold. Across the room you hear the muffled cough of the monarch behind drawn curtains. You wonder if you'll be able to sleep, knowing guards patrol just outside, knowing you are both honoured and watched. The more you think, the more you realize that beds in medieval castles weren't simply about comfort. They were about choreography, who was placed where, who was seen, who was hidden behind curtains, who slept nearest to the royal body. These decisions could alter alliances, cement friendships, or stoke jealousies. One night's arrangement might ripple into years of politics. So you leave the chamber with a final glance. The beds remain perfectly made, as though awaiting occupants who may never come. And you understand, in this frozen castle, where stone walls leak cold and fires sputter in massive hearths, even the act of sleeping was woven into the dance of politics and power. The corridor bends again, and you feel the air cool as you enter a chamber lined with shelves and chests. At first glance, it seems less impressive than the grand canopy rooms, but your eyes are quickly drawn to the piles of fabric stacked neatly in corners, folded over benches, and draped on frames to air out. This is the world of layered wool and pelts, the unsung heroes of medieval slumber. Here, textiles were not merely decoration but survival. One detail that emerges clearly from surviving records is that bedding was layered in astonishing abundance. Kings and queens did not rely on a single blanket to see them through the night. Instead, they piled on woolen sheets, fur-lined covers, and heavy quilts, one after another, until the weight itself pressed them down. Each layer held heat more effectively, each new piece of fabric acting as a barrier between royal flesh and the creeping chill that rolled off stone walls. Run your hand across one of these woolen blankets and you immediately notice the rough texture. It scratches a little, but the weave is dense, thick, and practical. The warmth comes not from softness, but from weight and insulation. Beneath that, imagine stretching out a fur coverlet, perhaps fox, wolf, or even ermine if you wanted to show off wealth. The smell of pelts lingers faintly earthy, musky, a reminder that these were once living creatures now pressed into the service of comfort. Strangely enough, some accounts tell us that furs were sometimes borrowed from ceremonial cloaks and repurposed at night. Imagine a queen slipping under her coronation robe, not for pomp, but for warmth. To modern ears, that sounds almost absurd, but in a castle where drafts crept like invisible serpents, extravagance doubled as insulation. Researchers remain divided over just how effective these layers were in practice. Some argue that by the time you stacked 4 or 5 heavy blankets and topped them with pelts, the warmth was more than sufficient, even stifling if a fire still smouldered in the hearth. Others suggest that the sheer volume of cold air seeping through shutters and down chimneys meant the heat dissipated almost immediately, leaving royalty swaddled but never truly comfortable. The question persists, were these layers enough? Or were kings and queens still waking with stiff, frozen fingers? You sit on the edge of one such bed in your mind, tugging the first wool blanket up to your chin. The weight presses against your chest, oddly reassuring, like being anchored against the night. Another layer goes on top, heavier, patterned with embroidered borders to signal status. Then comes a fur, thick and almost suffocating. By the time the final cover is spread, you feel entombed in fabric. Cozy, yes, but also constrained. Turning over must have been a clumsy maneuver, requiring the shifting of several dozen pounds of material. And then there is the smell, the lingering lanolin of unprocessed wool, the faint musk of animal hide, the smoky perfume absorbed from fires. You breathe it in and realize that medieval sleep had its own scent, a blend of earthy and acrid notes, far from the sterile fragrance of modern laundry detergent. An odd little detail preserved in some chronicles mentions that bed covers could also be scented with herbs, lavender, rosemary, or chamomile tucked into seams. This was not just for pleasant fragrance, but for supposed health benefits, to purify the air and ward off illness. You picture attendants shaking out blankets in the morning, little sprigs falling to the floor, a subtle ritual of both hygiene and superstition. The visual spectacle mattered too. These were not plain covers but works of art. Quilts were embroidered with dynastic symbols, pelts lined with silk edging, wool covers stitched with patterns meant to impress visitors. Sleep was survival, but it was also theatre, and every blanket had a role in the performance. Still, the question lingers in your mind. Did all those layers ever truly erase the bone-deep cold of a stone chamber in January? Some scholars argue that the layers worked remarkably well, creating pockets of trapped air that insulated like a primitive version of a down comforter. Others counter that the sheer scale of cold defeated even the heaviest furs, leaving monarchs to toss and turn despite their textile fortresses. The answer may never be certain, but the debate adds another wrinkle to your understanding. Close your eyes now, and you feel the weight of those layers pressing down, the heat slowly building, the claustrophobic sense of being swaddled like a child. It's oddly comforting, though your shoulders ache from immobility. You imagine drifting toward sleep, listening to the muffled sound of wind outside the curtains, cocooned in fabric that is as much status symbol as it is insulation. In the half-light, you notice something else: the sheer labor behind these layers. Each cover had to be woven, dyed, embroidered, cleaned and maintained by armies of servants. The wool came from flocks tended by peasants in distant fields. The furs came from hunters who risked wilderness and snow. The embroidery was done by patient fingers bent over frames for months. A royal night's sleep was not just an accident of wealth, it was the end point of countless hours of human toil. You linger in that thought as the fire flickers low. Sleep in a medieval castle wasn't the silent, solitary act you know today. It was communal, political, and above all, labor-intensive. Each blanket on the bed represented power, trade, and social order stitched into fabric. You wrap another imagined layer around yourself, the weight almost unbearable now, and wonder, was it warmth they sought, or reassurance that their authority stretched even into the realm of dreams? The further you walk, the more the enormity of stone presses itself on your senses. You pause in a side passage where the torch guttering in your hand casts faint shadows across walls that seem to stretch forever upward. The air is sharp and damp, carrying the taste of minerals and moss. This is the part that the guidebooks rarely mention. Stone walls are not neutral backdrops, they are cold engines of discomfort. When winter comes, every surface becomes an accomplice to the chill. We know from countless architectural surveys that castles were marvels of defense but disasters for warmth. The very thickness of the walls, sometimes over 10 feet, meant they stored cold like vast iceboxes. Step close to them, press your palm against the uneven surface, and you would feel an almost metallic sting. There is no insulation, no barrier of wood or plasterboard, just raw stone soaking up the night frost and exhaling it back into the chamber. As you imagine lying in bed against such a wall, you shiver involuntarily. The drafts were relentless. Gaps around window shutters, cracks in door frames, and the open design of stairwells funneled air into every chamber. Even the tapestries, heavy and richly woven, were more than decoration. They were primitive insulation, hung not merely to boast of lineage but to muffle the constant hiss of air sneaking through every seam. One curious observation preserved in some household accounts is that nobles rotated their hangings seasonally. In summer, lighter fabrics were hung. In winter, the heaviest wool or velvet was brought out to line walls and even ceilings. Imagine servants climbing ladders to tack up enormous cloths overhead, turning a room into a padded box in the hope of softening the icy assault. It seems almost desperate, yet it shows how fully the architecture dictated the rhythms of life. Scholars remain divided about the actual comfort levels inside these grand structures. Some argue that once heavy curtains were drawn and tapestries lined the walls, the microclimate could become tolerably warm, at least near the fire. Others insist the overwhelming cold persisted, making castles inhospitable for much of the year, useful only as defensive refuges rather than genuine homes. The truth, as usual, likely lay somewhere in between pockets of coziness carved out within an ocean of draught. You walk further into the imagined chamber, and your torchlight falls on a small arrow slit. The narrow opening once served archers, but in peacetime it was a permanent leak to the outdoors. Coverings might be wedged in place, but wind found its way regardless. You lean close and hear the faint whistle of air, a constant reminder that comfort was secondary to fortification. Think the sensory reality, the smell of damp stone, the faint trickle of water as condensation ran down walls, the touch of cold surfaces numbing fingertips. The acoustics were harsh, every cough or shuffle amplified in the echoing chamber. Sleep here was never silent serenity. It was a battle between body heat and architecture. Oddly enough, some medieval sources recommended not sleeping directly against the wall at all. Beds were often pulled away from the stone, positioned nearer the fire or in the room's center, leaving a cold corridor of air along the perimeter. This little practical adjustment was less about elegance and more about survival. It's one of those subtle adaptations that modern visitors often miss, but it tells you volumes about daily life. Close your eyes and imagine it now. You are lying beneath thick covers, but you've placed your bed strategically away from the wall. You can still hear the wind rattling the shutters. You sense the stone breathing its cold into the chamber. The fire crackles weakly in the hearth, but the heat never quite reaches your feet. It is as if the castle itself conspires against sleep, reminding you every moment that defense and comfort do not coexist. The debate among experts goes further. Was the cold simply tolerated, accepted as part of life, or did it actively shorten lifespans, spread illness, and shape medieval attitudes toward the night? Some researchers suggest the chill contributed to chronic respiratory issues. Others counter that people acclimated, their bodies hardier for it. The argument continues, unresolved, and perhaps unresolvable, since the subjective experience of shivering kings and queens can never be measured directly. Still, the architectural choices left their mark on ritual. You think of courtiers drawing thick curtains around beds, attendants adding fresh logs to fires every few hours, maids shaking dampness out of wool hangings. Entire routines grew from the fact that stone walls would never relent. The castle was a machine of war, but for those who had to live in it, it was also a stubborn, unyielding adversary. You run your hand once more along the stone, feeling the chill sink into your skin. This, you realize, was the background music of every medieval winter night, the silent hum of cold radiating through masonry. No amount of jewels or banners could change that. The monarch who ruled vast territories was powerless against the walls of his own chamber. And so you step away, your torchlight wavering, the stone looming like a frozen ocean at your back. Sleep, in this world, was not a gentle retreat. It was an uneasy negotiation with the very architecture that was meant to protect you. The corridor narrows, then widens into another hall, this one marked immediately by the blackened stone of a hearth. You feel the shift in the air as your torchlight glimmers across soot-stained walls. This is the heart of warmth in a medieval chamber. Or at least, it tried to be. Fireplaces and braziers were the monarch's first line of defense against the long, punishing nights of winter. One certainty we have from architectural remains is that fireplaces became standard features in high-status rooms by the late Middle Ages. Before that, heating relied on central hearths, open flames set into the floor of a hall, their smoke escaping through crude vents or just drifting until it seeped from the rafters. By the time great castles reached their full splendor, royal chambers had wall-mounted fireplaces with chimneys designed to draw the smoke upward. They looked impressive, with carved mantels and decorative stonework, but the warmth they provided was often laughably insufficient. Step closer, and you notice how the flames dance but never roar. The fireplace is broad, but the draft from the chimney sucks much of the heat straight up and away. You hold your hands out and find that your palms warm nicely, but take one step back and the cold wraps around you again like a cloak. To sit by the fire was comfort. To lie in bed across the chamber was still a gamble. Oddly enough, some monarchs used portable braziers, metal bowls filled with glowing coals that could be moved closer to the bed. The idea was simple. If the fireplace couldn't heat the entire room, perhaps a smaller portable furnace could. Imagine the glow of red embers hissing faintly as they burned, the faint crackle when a servant tossed in a fresh lump of charcoal. The smell was metallic, smoky, sometimes acrid, a mixture of heat and hazard. Because here lies the problem. Smoke. Fires and braziers made warmth possible, but they also filled chambers with noxious fumes. Records from household accounts describe coughing fits, headaches, and watery eyes signs of carbon monoxide exposure, though no one at the time could name it. Survival was always a balance: shiver in the cold, or risk suffocation in the dark. Specialists continue to disagree about how effectively fires heated these immense rooms. Some argue that large hearths, kept stoked all night, could make the chamber almost comfortable, at least in the radius of a few yards. Others insist that the sheer scale of stone halls ensured that most of the heat was wasted, vanishing upward through chimneys or dissipating into icy masonry. The truth probably varied depending on the size of the chamber, the fuel supply, and the diligence of attendants. Now picture yourself trying to sleep near one of these fires. The air closest to the flames is warm, almost too warm on your face, but your back remains chilled. You roll over, tugging the covers tighter, trying to balance the uneven waves of heat. Every crackle from the logs is loud in the night silence, sparks occasionally leaping and scattering. The light is comforting but also restless, flickering against the canopy curtains like ghostly dancers. One curious practice mentioned in a few chronicles is that servants sometimes carried pans of hot ash from the kitchen to the royal bedchamber, using them to kindle fresh fires before dawn. Imagine the procession: sleepy attendants tiptoeing with glowing pans, the faint hiss of embers reigniting a tired hearth, the monarch stirring beneath layers of blankets as warmth returned, just in time for morning prayers. It's a detail that speaks to how fragile comfort was never lasting, always dependent on constant tending. The sensory atmosphere grows sharper in your mind. The smell of burning wood clings to every surface, saturating curtains, tapestries, and hair. The floor near the hearth is gritty with ash. The sound of wood popping in the night is both soothing and startling, like distant musket fire. Smoke lingers low, especially when damp logs sputter, filling the lungs with bitterness. You close your eyes and cough once, realizing just how much nightly life was entwined with fire. And yet, for all its flaws, the fireplace became a stage of its own. Monarchs often had elaborate mantels carved with family crests or biblical scenes, turning the hearth into a symbol of continuity. Visitors entering the chamber would see not only the glow of warmth but the glow of lineage, Even survival was turned into spectacle. The debate lingers in your mind as you sit by the imagined fire. Was this meager heat truly enough to offset the endless drafts? Or did kings and queens lie awake, one side of their body burning while the other froze, cursing the very walls built to protect them? Perhaps the truth is that sleep came not because of comfort, but because exhaustion eventually triumphed over discomfort. Think of the servants again, crouched nearby to keep the flames alive. Their night was restless, filled with the duty of feeding the fire. In their hands, the survival of the monarch's comfort rested. Without them, the fire would sputter out by midnight, leaving only cold ashes and bitter dreams. As the last log crumbles into embers, you sense the fragility of this entire system. Royal power could command armies, raise taxes, and dictate law, but it could not command fire to last forever. In the end, every night was a contest between flames and frost, one that rarely ended in total victory. You lean back, the warmth fading from your face, the cold pressing in again from behind. Sleep in this chamber was never a perfect retreat. It was an uneasy truce between stone, smoke, and flame, where even the richest monarch relied on flickering logs to survive till dawn. The next chamber you step into is smaller, darker, and lined with wooden chests that smell faintly of iron and soot. A servant kneels by the bed, sliding something curious between the sheets. A long-handled pan, metal gleaming, filled with glowing embers. You recognize it instantly as one of the oddest tools of medieval comfort, the bed warmer. Evidence from inventories and household accounts confirms that bed warmers were common in royal and noble residences by the later Middle Ages. They were simple contraptions, a shallow metal pan with a hinged lid, mounted on a long handle, filled with hot coals or ashes. The servant would swing or slide the pan gently beneath the covers to take the icy edge off before the monarch climbed into bed. It was not central heating, but in a castle where stone radiated frost, it must have felt like a miracle. You lean closer and hear the faint hiss as sparks meet fabric. The risk is immediate. The ember pan smoulders dangerously near wool and linen. It's a delicate dance, warmth without fire, heat without disaster. Many an anxious attendant must have feared scorching the royal sheets or, worse, igniting them. Yet necessity demanded risk. One odd little anecdote preserved in letters tells of a lady-in-waiting who forgot to latch the lid of the warmer, scattering glowing coals across the chamber floor. The ensuing panic shouts, stomping feet. A frantic bucket of water shows just how precarious this nightly ritual could be. Imagine trying to fall asleep in peace, knowing your bedding had been in intimate contact with fire only moments before. Academic opinion diverges on how effective these devices truly were. Some specialists argue that bed warmers offered only fleeting comfort, heating the sheets briefly before the cold returned. Others maintain that, when used correctly, they created a pocket of warmth lasting long enough for the sleeper's body heat to take over. The truth likely varied with skill, timing, and the sheer willpower of sleepy attendants tasked with juggling embers. You picture the scene with more clarity now. The chamber is draughty, but the servant has just finished his work. The monarch slips into bed, the linen no longer stiff with ice but faintly warm, releasing a sigh of relief. Curtains are drawn, the glow of the fire dims, and for a few precious minutes the illusion of comfort prevails. Then the air slowly reclaims its dominion, the sheets cooling inch by inch. The cycle repeats the next evening, a ritual of warmth that was always temporary. The sensory elements are vivid. You can smell the metallic tang of hot iron, the acrid sweetness of burning coal. Your fingers brush the sheets and feel residual warmth fading like breath on glass. The sound of the pans scraping softly against the bed frame echoes in the quiet chamber. It is comfort delivered with smoke and risk, intimacy balanced on the edge of danger. There is also something ceremonial about it. The act of warming the bed was not just practical but symbolic, a mark of service, a demonstration of loyalty. To slide glowing embers beneath the king's sheets was to declare that even his most vulnerable moment, the act of sleep, was shielded by devoted attendants. The monarch lay in warmth not solely because of technology, but because of people. And what of the servants themselves? Imagine their hands, calloused and singed from handling these devices night after night, their nostrils filled with smoke, their eyes watering from sparks. They were the invisible guarantors of comfort, sacrificing ease so that someone else might fall asleep more quickly. The human toll of medieval warmth is easy to forget, yet it burned into every ember. A quirky little variation existed as well. Some records mention hot stones wrapped in cloth or bricks heated in the hearth, slipped into beds to radiate gentler, longer-lasting heat. Unlike ember pans, these carried less risk of fire, but offered less intensity. The choice between stone and coal was another nightly calculation, a balancing act between safety and immediate relief. As you pull the imagined covers up around your shoulders, you think about how fleeting this comfort must have been. The momentary glow would fade within minutes, leaving the sleeper once more dependent on thick blankets and body heat. The bed warmer was a gesture, not a solution, an opening act for a long night of shivering endurance. Still, the ritual mattered. It gave the impression that warmth could be commanded, that even the coldest castle could bend to human ingenuity. Perhaps it was less about temperature and more about reassurance, the psychological balm of sliding into sheets that had been briefly kissed by fire. In a world where control was everything, even temporary mastery over the cold carried meaning. You stand again by the door of the chamber, watching the last wisps of smoke curl from the metal pan as it cools. The monarch sleeps, cocooned in curtains, while servants clear away the dangerous tool. Tomorrow night it will be repeated, the same dance of coals and linen, risk and relief. And you realize, stepping back into the corridor, that medieval warmth was always fleeting. Fires died, furs chilled, coals cooled. Nothing lasted. Comfort was not permanent, but purchased nightly through ritual, danger, and relentless effort. It makes you smile faintly because, in a way, the bed warmer tells the whole story of medieval sleep. Ingenious, precarious, and never quite enough. You move deeper into the castle's sleeping world, and this time what catches your eye is not the bed itself but the clothing draped across stools and pegs. Here lies another forgotten layer of medieval survival, the garments people wore to bed. For kings and queens, sleep did not mean slipping into silk pajamas or nothing at all. It meant dressing strategically, layering against the cold, turning nightwear into armor against the frost. Surviving household records tell us plainly that specialized nightclothes existed. Monarchs and nobles wore long linen shirts, sometimes reaching to the ankles, functioning as both undergarments and sleepwear. These were paired with woolen hose, heavy socks, or occasionally gloves. And most iconic of all, the nightcap. You imagine a king pulling a soft cap over his head before crawling under furs, the tassel brushing against his cheek as he settled into place. Think of how necessary it was. The head, after all, loses heat quickly. In a chamber where breath crystallized in the air, covering every inch of skin became essential. The idea of sleeping in full layers may feel suffocating to you now, but to them it was the difference between life and a shivering vigil till dawn. Curiously, some accounts suggest that royalty even wore multiple layers of tunics at night, essentially turning sleep into another form of daily dress. Imagine fumbling under piles of blankets while swaddled in 2 or 3 wool garments, the weight so heavy that rolling over required determination. Comfort was sacrificed to survival, and nobody doubted the necessity. Experts continue to disagree about just how heavy these layers were. Some argue that monarchs, cushioned by fires and tapestries, might have managed with only modest nightshirts. Others insist the bitter cold demanded full dress, sometimes even with cloaks pulled across the shoulders. The debate continues, fueled by scattered descriptions in inventories and letters. The truth is likely that it varied from castle to castle, and from one bitter January to a milder March. The quirky detail that lingers is the fashion of sleeping caps. They were not only practical but sometimes personalized, embroidered with initials or decorated with tiny stitches. Imagine the strange intimacy of a queen removing her jeweled crown at night, only to don a humble wool cap, a reversal that stripped away grandeur but revealed vulnerability. You smile, picturing a ruler of half of Europe snuggled into bed, looking like a child in a Christmas play. The sensory imagery grows sharper as you imagine slipping into these garments yourself. The linen shirt is stiff at first, then softens against your skin. The woolen socks scratch a little, but they cushion your feet from the icy sheets. The cap warms your scalp, muffling the sounds of the chamber around you. You feel bundled, almost swaddled, and as you lie back, the sheer volume of fabric presses gently against your limbs, a cocoon against the relentless cold. There is something psychological here, too. To dress for bed was to signal transition, to mark the line between the day's ceremonies and the night's fragile rest. Even kings and queens needed rituals of closure, washing their hands, saying prayers, donning nightshirts. The nightcap, small as it was, symbolized the final step into vulnerability. Some letters from the 15th century even describe noble families giving finely made nightshirts as gifts. It seems strange at first, but when you consider the climate, it makes sense. To present a beautifully embroidered linen gown was to offer not just fabric, but warmth, safety, and intimacy. Sleep itself was commodified, turned into a currency of favor and affection. And then there were the moments of humor. Chronicles sometimes mention servants laughing quietly when courtiers scurried down corridors in nightclothes, startled awake by alarms or sudden visits. Imagine the indignity. A duke dashing through stone halls in a long linen shirt, cap askew, shivering as he tried to look dignified. Even the most powerful men and women were reduced to their undergarments by the cold and the darkness. The debate among researchers lingers. Were these layers purely practical, or did they also carry symbolic meaning? Some argue that richly embroidered nightshirts were intended to demonstrate status even in private, while others see them as proof that even royalty could not escape the humble necessities of human life. Perhaps the truth is both. Nightclothes protected against the cold, but they also reminded everyone, monarch and servant alike, that even in bed, status had to be stitched into fabric. Now imagine yourself climbing into a curtained bed, your body wrapped in wool, linen, and fur, your head tucked under a cap. You shift once, twice, trying to find ease under the weight. You breathe into your own hands, warming them through the fabric of gloves. Your skin prickles with the itch of wool. Your chest tightens beneath layers. And yet you are grateful, because without it, the cold would gnaw at you until dawn. The torch guttering in the corner sends shadows across the pile of discarded cloaks and boots. Attendants retreat quietly, leaving only the rustle of fabric as the monarch turns in bed. For a brief moment, the world feels still, wrapped in layers, cocooned beneath curtains. The king or queen yields to sleep. And you realize, stepping softly back into the hall, that medieval nightclothes were not just garments. They were shields, stitched, woven, and pulled tight against the castle's endless winter breath. In those quiet hours, crowns and scepters meant little. Survival came instead from socks, gloves, and the humble nightcap. The chamber you step into next is grander again, though not because of its bed or its hangings. This room exudes power in another way. Standing in the shadows are men in fine livery, quiet and still, their presence unmistakable. These are the chamberlains, the keepers of royal privacy, the gatekeepers of who approached the bed. You sense immediately that this was not just a sleeping room, it was a stage of constant negotiation where entry was controlled with precision. From official records and court manuals, we know that the bedchamber was one of the most restricted spaces in any castle. A monarch's safety depended on it. Only a handful of trusted attendants were ever allowed past the heavy door, and each had a specific duty. The chamberlain managed access. The groom of the stool oversaw personal necessities. Pages tended to clothing or fires, and guards stood discreetly outside. Together, they formed a human shield around the royal body, at its most vulnerable. Think about the vulnerability of sleep. For all their crowns and armies, kings and queens were defenseless once they closed their eyes. That made the bedchamber both the most intimate and the most political room in the palace. Who was permitted to cross its threshold was a question of trust, and trust was never given lightly. One curious fact appears in household rosters. The chamberlain often kept literal keys to the room, a responsibility that carried immense weight. To hold those keys was to hold symbolic power, a reminder that privacy was not owned by the monarch alone, but mediated through loyal servants. It is startling, isn't it, to realize that even the most powerful ruler in Europe relied on a handful of attendants to guard the sanctity of their rest. And then there are the more peculiar details. Letters from visiting ambassadors sometimes complain of being kept waiting for hours outside the royal chamber, only to be admitted for a few minutes while the monarch lounged in bed. It wasn't inefficiency, it was deliberate choreography. By restricting access, chamberlains heightened the aura of majesty, ensuring that glimpses of the royal body, even swaddled under blankets, felt like a privilege. Researchers continue to argue about just how much privacy monarchs truly had. Some suggest that kings and queens managed secret retreats, smaller side rooms where they could slip away and sleep without witnesses. Others believe that nearly all royal slumber was supervised in some form, with attendants always nearby, ready to act. The lack of surviving evidence keeps the debate alive, leaving you to imagine the spectrum, from solitude stolen in hidden chambers to lives lived permanently on display. Close your eyes and picture the nightly routine. Before sleep, the monarch is undressed by attendants, layer after layer of clothing carefully removed, folded, and stored. The chamberlain ensures the bed is prepared, the covers turned down, the bed warmer applied. Once the monarch climbs beneath the curtains, attendants extinguish candles, mutter prayers, and retreat to their pallets by the door. The chamber falls silent, but never entirely. A cough, a shifting boot, a creak of armor reminds you that you are never truly alone. The sensory experience is complex. The heavy wooden door closes with a thud, but you still hear faint murmurs from guards in the passage. The rustle of fabric as an attendant bows and departs is the last human sound before sleep. The air smells of beeswax and ash, and behind the curtains the monarch inhales deeply, trying to forget that others stand watch only feet away. One amusing little vignette survives from a court chronicle. A chamberlain once tripped over a dog curled at the foot of the royal bed while making his nightly rounds. The king, half asleep, reportedly scolded him with such humor that the story spread through the household. Even in a space charged with solemnity, accidents and laughter crept in. The presence of attendants meant that no moment was entirely private, not even a stumble in the dark. You start to realize that the chamberlains were more than guards. They were curators of image. They decided who could glimpse the monarch in bed, who could deliver petitions, who could share in those intimate hours. Access became currency, and with it came rivalries. To be shut out of the chamber was to be cut off from influence. To be admitted was to stand at the edge of power itself. The debate lingers in academic circles. Was this arrangement primarily about physical safety, or was it also about performance? Some argue that the constant presence of attendants was necessary to prevent assassination, rebellion, or betrayal. Others emphasize the ritualistic side, where the bed became a stage and the chamberlains its stage managers, ensuring the monarch was always framed as inaccessible, mysterious, and divinely chosen. Likely, both are true. Now imagine yourself as the monarch. You slip under the covers, curtains drawn, fire flickering low. You know that outside the fabric barrier stand men who can hear you breathe, who will leap up at the first sound of distress. You are cocooned, but also surveilled. You are safe, but never free. It is both reassurance and imprisonment, comfort and unease entwined. Morning comes, and the ritual reverses. Attendants fling open the curtains, help you into your robes, bring basins of water for washing. The bedchamber transforms from intimate sanctuary to public theatre once again. You cannot separate the two. The very place you dream is also the place where power is negotiated, whispered, and displayed. You step back into the corridor, and the lesson clings to you. Medieval kings and queens never slept alone in the way you understand it. They slept guarded, attended, and observed. Privacy was an illusion maintained by curtains, while trust was enforced by chamberlains with keys. The monarch's most private chamber was, paradoxically, one of the most political spaces in the entire castle. You walk softly into the next royal chamber, and at first glance it looks familiar. A massive bed curtained in velvet, the fire hissing low in the hearth, the walls lined with tapestries. But something in the atmosphere is different. The air feels heavier, more charged. Here, the bed was not simply a place of rest. It was a stage for intimacy, secrecy, and politics rolled into one. Contemporary chronicles make clear that the royal bed often doubled as a meeting space. Councils were sometimes held in these chambers. Advisors gathered close while the monarch reclined against embroidered pillows. To discuss treaties while half covered in blankets might seem odd to you now, but for medieval rulers it made sense. The bedchamber was both the most private and the most secure room in the castle, guarded by trusted attendants. If delicate matters needed to be whispered, alliances negotiated, treachery uncovered, favors granted, the royal bed was as good a table as any. Imagine the scene: the king propped up beneath a canopy, courtiers perched on stools or even leaning on the mattress edge, voices low and tense as they debated strategy. The crackle of the fire mixes with the murmur of secrets, and every word carries weight. What begins as a bedroom moment becomes a council chamber, the intimacy amplifying the stakes. One well-documented example comes from the French court, where ambassadors were sometimes admitted directly to the royal bedchamber for audiences. They described the experience as both flattering and unnerving. To be so close to the king while he reclined in bed was an honor, but it also blurred boundaries. Was this informal access, or was it theatre meant to disarm visitors? The ambiguity was part of the power. Then there are the stranger details. Letters from ladies-in-waiting describe how beds occasionally hosted entire conversations late into the night. Courtiers sprawled around like gossiping students. Secrets were exchanged, rumors fermented, and alliances tested in whispers between yawns. You can almost hear the chuckles stifled behind bed curtains, the hurried hush when an attendant entered, the sudden shift back to solemnity. Experts disagree on how much of this intimacy was intentional statecraft and how much was simply practical. Some argue that monarchs deliberately used their beds as stages to blur lines, projecting an image of approachability while still asserting authority. Others suggest it was the natural result of cramped living spaces, where privacy was scarce and the warmest chamber naturally became the meeting point. Either way, the symbolism endured. To be admitted to the royal bed was to stand in the inner circle. Now imagine yourself in that circle. You sit on a small stool, the fire flickering against your face, while the queen leans back against cushions embroidered with golden lilies. Her hair is unbound, her hands folded in her lap, yet her voice is calm and commanding. She asks your opinion on a matter of war or marriage, and suddenly you realize that in this quiet, dimly lit chamber, decisions are being made that will ripple across kingdoms. The intimacy makes the gravity even more intense. And then comes the oddest image: a royal bed, not as a private retreat but as a platform for ritualized diplomacy. Sometimes, visitors were invited to witness the monarch rising in the morning or being tucked in at night, ceremonies that blended intimacy with spectacle. Imagine filing into a chamber to watch your ruler drink spiced wine before bed, or recite prayers while attendants arranged pillows. It seems absurdly personal, yet it was a calculated act of power. By sharing these private rituals, monarchs bound their courtiers more tightly, reminding them of their dependence. One quirky story tells of a visiting ambassador who was utterly bewildered when invited to speak with a king already half asleep under his covers. The man reportedly stammered his message, unsure whether to bow, kneel, or sit at the bedside. It's almost comical, but it highlights the strange collision of vulnerability and authority in these moments. The sensory world of such a chamber is intense. The bed curtains trap the smell of wool and perfume. The fire sputters with occasional sparks. The air feels heavy with both warmth and tension. You hear whispers layered over the creak of floorboards, the rustle of fabric as courtiers shift uncomfortably on stools. The monarch's voice, muffled by pillows, carries across the hush. Every detail reinforces the sense that the bed itself is a throne in disguise. Historians continue to debate whether this blending of sleep and politics weakened or strengthened royal authority. Some see it as a dilution, making monarchs appear too human, too vulnerable. Others argue the opposite, that the deliberate blurring of boundaries magnified mystique, keeping outsiders perpetually off balance. The fact that so many ambassadors wrote about the strangeness of being admitted to a bedchamber suggests it worked as intended. It left an impression not easily forgotten. Now, place yourself behind the curtains, lying on the mattress as the last attendants retreat. You feel the indent of where advisors sat moments earlier, their words still echoing in your ears. The fire burns low, the chamber grows quiet, yet the weight of politics lingers in the fabric. Even in sleep you cannot escape it. Tomorrow the cycle will repeat. Counsel at the bedside, whispers at the pillow, decisions made in the fragile space between rest and wakefulness. You step back into the corridor, the sound of voices fading from memory, and you realize something profound. In the medieval world, there was no true boundary between the political and the personal, the ceremonial and the private. Even the bed, that most intimate of refuges, was a stage where power played itself out. The corridor you follow now twists downward toward a wing of the castle that feels less ceremonial and more practical. The walls are plainer, the ceilings lower, the air sharper. You enter a chamber filled not with velvet curtains but with travel trunks, folded tents, and rolled bedding. This is the world of the royal travelling bed, the companion that followed kings and queens wherever their duties or whims carried them. From surviving household accounts, we know that monarchs rarely stayed in one castle for long. Courts were mobile, drifting between palaces, fortresses, and hunting lodges. And when war or pilgrimage demanded it, the king or queen ventured into tents pitched in hostile fields or icy forests. Yet even in those circumstances, they did not surrender the comforts of ritual sleep. Beds were dismantled, packed onto carts and reassembled like puzzle pieces wherever the royal body required rest. Think about what that meant. Servants lugging heavy oak posts through mud, dragging mattresses wrapped in oilcloth to protect against rain, carrying embroidered curtains through mountain passes. It was an enormous effort, yet one deemed essential. The royal bed was not just furniture, it was a portable symbol of majesty, an anchor of continuity, even in the most uncertain places. One detail recorded in English royal inventories is particularly striking. Henry VIII travelled with an entire dismantleable bed of state, carved, painted, and complete with canopy. Imagine the absurd sight of a gilded bed frame emerging from a wagon in the middle of a battlefield camp, while soldiers huddled nearby on straw pallets. The bed announced that the king remained king, even when surrounded by mud and fear. And here's a strange, almost comic note. In some expeditions, portable beds were so large and elaborate that setting them up required entire teams of carpenters. Chronicles describe tents straining under the weight of wooden frames, ropes creaking as servants struggled to raise canopies inside canvas pavilions. You almost hear the grunts, the laughter, the muttered curses as royal dignity was rebuilt in the middle of nowhere. Experts still puzzle over how effective these travelling beds truly were. Did they offer real comfort, or were they more symbolic gestures? Some argue the familiarity of one's own mattress and hangings provided genuine warmth and psychological reassurance. Others believe the effort far outweighed the benefit, that no matter how many furs you piled, a tent pitched on frozen ground could never feel like home. The lack of agreement shows how blurred the line was between practicality and performance. Picture yourself inside one of those campaign tents now. Outside, snow crunches under the boots of guards, and the night wind snaps the canvas like a drum. Inside, the royal bed stands proudly, its curtains drawn, its blankets thick with fur. A brazier glows nearby, throwing sparks against the damp walls of the tent. You crawl beneath the covers and feel the reassuring familiarity of the same fabrics you slept under at Windsor or Rouen. The illusion of continuity holds, even if the ground beneath you is mud. The sensory details crowd in. The air smells of wet wool, wood smoke, and the faint tang of horse dung carried in from the stables. The fire crackles but never quite warms the air. The mattress feels lumpy from travel, feathers clumped from damp. The curtain muffles some noise, but you still hear the restless stamping of hooves outside, the mutter of soldiers, the occasional clatter of armor. Sleep is shallow, broken, threaded with the sounds of war, yet the symbolism mattered more than the rest. To maintain the ritual of the royal bed was to insist that even on campaign, the monarch was more than just another soldier. His body, his sleep, his very dreams were framed as sacred. To lie in that bed was to carry majesty into the mud. It reassured followers, reminded allies, and projected continuity in the face of chaos. One amusing little anecdote survives from the Burgundian court. A duke's bed was so grand and so heavily curtained that when set up inside a tent, it collapsed under its own weight. The chronicler dryly noted that the duke slept humbly upon a chest that night, a rare moment when status bowed to practicality. You smile, imagining the laughter muffled in the dark as servants scrambled to salvage dignity. The academic conversation around traveling beds touches on psychology. Was this about warmth or about maintaining the illusion of control? Some scholars suggest that the very act of sleeping in familiar surroundings, even within a hostile environment, calmed rulers, allowing them to project confidence. Others argue that these beds were stage props, seen by courtiers and allies more than used by the monarch themselves. Either way, the spectacle of a bed reconstructed in a frozen field remains unforgettable. Now imagine yourself lying there as king or queen. The tent flaps snap in the wind, a candle sputters, and the curtain of your bed shields you from curious eyes. For a few moments, wrapped in the same embroidered sheets that touched your skin back in your palace, you can pretend the world outside is not chaos. You drift into sleep, not because it is warm, but because ritual makes it familiar. You step back from the tent in your mind, leaving the bed to loom alone in the flickering firelight. And you realize something essential. Medieval kings and queens did not simply sleep where they were told. They brought their world with them, reconstructed it night after night, a portable fortress of fabric and ritual. In winter fields, icy forests, or smoky hunting lodges, the royal bed was always there, carrying the illusion of permanence across landscapes of uncertainty. You leave the campaign tents behind in your imagination and return to a castle chamber. This one feels different, not because of its size or the quality of its hangings, but because of its atmosphere. The fire glows in the hearth, throwing a restless light across stone walls, but the room still feels dim, almost smoky. You squint and realize why. The air is thick with candlelight haze, a veil of wax and soot that never quite clears. One thing that is beyond dispute is that medieval nights were illuminated not by electricity but by fire, candles, rushlights, and oil lamps. In royal chambers, beeswax candles were favored, cleaner and more expensive than the tallow versions peasants used. Their pale golden flames flickered with a steadier glow, casting long shadows across tapestries and canopies. The smell was sweet, almost honeyed, yet underneath it lingered the tang of smoke. Even beeswax could not erase the reality of combustion inside stone rooms. Think of it, the king or queen lying beneath furs, the bed curtains drawn, while a single candle burned nearby on a table wall sconce. The flame quivered every time a draught slipped through shutters, light bending like a dancer across the chamber. Sleep came in a flickering world of half-light, never quite secure, never quite still. Curiously, accounts from visitors often mention the smokiness of these chambers. Fireplaces did not always draw properly, especially in windy weather. A gust from the wrong direction could send smoke billowing back into the room, blackening ceilings, staining curtains, and stinging eyes. You cough in your imagination now, the acrid taste catching in your throat, the soft rustle of sheets muffling the sound. One odd note from a 15th century inventory describes candles being snuffed out by servants after the monarch was in bed, only for one to be relit at intervals to check the room. Imagine the disturbance. Half asleep royalty stirred by the strike of flint and steel, eyelids fluttering open as another wisp of smoke filled the canopy. Comfort was not continuous but intermittent, punctuated by the rhythms of flame. Specialists are still divided on how tolerable this environment really was. Some argue that the sheer number of tapestries and hangings absorbed much of the smoke, dulling its effect. Others counter that prolonged exposure must have been suffocating, leaving bedsheets reeking of soot and lungs clogged. The truth may lie in between, a blend of luxury and irritation, where sweet wax mingled uneasily with acrid fumes. The sensory scene grows vivid. You smell beeswax melting, earthy and rich. You hear the faint crackle of a rushlight, the snap of a log in the hearth. Shadows leap along the canopy above you, twisting into grotesque shapes that look almost alive. The curtains trap the warmth but also the haze, making the space cozy yet slightly stifling. And there's another curious fact. Lighting was also symbolic. To burn beeswax candles was not merely practical but a sign of wealth, since beeswax was costly to produce and trade. A royal chamber glowing with 10 or 20 candles was more than illuminated, it was flaunting prosperity. Every flicker carried economic weight, every shadow a reminder that commoners were lucky to have even a smoky tallow stub. Imagine the psychological side as well. Flickering light changes perception, making walls waver, and tapestries seem to shift. You lie in bed, eyes heavy, but the patterns on the curtains seem alive in the half-glow. Was that a lion's head, or did it move just now? Was the figure of St. Michael frowning at you, or was it only the angle of the flame? Dreams and waking blurred in such a world, fire and shadow conspiring to conjure phantoms. An amusing story survives of a courtier nodding off in a chair near the bedchamber fire, his wig or what passed for one catching a stray spark. The commotion of stamping feet and laughter woke the king himself, who reportedly found the scene so funny that he delayed sleep to watch the poor man's embarrassment. Even in smoky discomfort, moments of humor punctured the solemnity of night. Scholars keep arguing about the psychological effects of all this light and smoke. Was it a comfort, making night less terrifying, or did it keep people half wakeful, their sleep fragmented by shadows and fumes? Some argue that medieval people were accustomed to it, their bodies trained to sleep in shorter cycles. Others insist that disturbed rest shaped their worldview, blending waking life with dreamlike impressions. Either way, the nightly haze left its mark. Now imagine yourself again in that chamber. You lie on a straw feather mattress, wrapped in furs, your nightcap pulled low. A candle sputters beside you, casting a warm glow on your hands. You close your eyes, but light seeps through the curtains. Shadows slip across your eyelids. The fire spits, sending a puff of smoke into the canopy. You turn, cough once, then settle again, halfway between sleep and waking. This was royal comfort, not perfection, but compromise. As dawn nears, the last candle gutters out, leaving only smoke drifting lazily in the chamber. The monarch stirs, eyes smarting, sheets scented of wax and ash. Outside, servants prepare to throw shutters wide, letting in the icy morning air. Night has ended, but the memory of flickering flames and smoky breath clings to the bed like an invisible veil. And as you step back into the corridor, you realize medieval sleep was never pure silence or darkness. It was a theatre of shadows, illuminated by beeswax and wood smoke, where kings and queens drifted off under a haze that blurred reality and dream. The next chamber feels quieter, more subdued, and at once you sense its difference. The decorations are gentler, the furnishings slightly smaller, the air tinged with lavender instead of heavy smoke. This is the Queen's own space, her separate chamber, distinct from the King's daughter. Unlike the grand beds of state where politics unfolded, these rooms were crafted with another rhythm, blending comfort, ceremony, and constraint in a uniquely feminine domain. Records from royal households make it clear that queens often maintained their own sleeping quarters. Sometimes these chambers were directly adjoining the king's, connected by a narrow passage or guarded doorway. Other times they were farther away, in entirely different wings. The separation was practical as well as symbolic. Queens oversaw their own attendance, managed household accounts, and required privacy to conduct rituals associated with pregnancy, childbirth, or devotion. A royal marriage bed may have been paraded on special occasions, but much of the nightly reality was lived apart. Imagine the difference. Step inside, and you see a bed still rich with curtains and tapestries, but the atmosphere is softer. Embroidery lines the walls with scenes of saints or flowers rather than battles. The sheets smell of herbs tucked into seams, rosemary or lavender meant to calm the body. A prie-dieu kneeling desk stands close at hand, reminding you that devotion was expected at all hours. This chamber radiates both intimacy and duty. One fascinating account comes from the household ordinances of Queen Isabella of France, which list the daily routine of her ladies-in-waiting. They attended her closely as she undressed, helped with prayers, and even slept nearby on pallets. The Queen's chamber was not solitude, but a stage of female community, where attendants shared whispers late into the night. It was protection, companionship, and control all at once. And then there are the quirks that make you smile. Chronicles occasionally mention queens keeping small lapdogs or even monkeys in their chambers, creatures prized not just as pets but as status symbols. Imagine the incongruity: a richly dressed monarch preparing for bed, while a chattering monkey leaps across tapestries or a tiny spaniel curls up beneath the blankets. It breaks the solemnity and adds a note of warmth to an otherwise rigid setting. Scholars continue to discuss how much autonomy queens really had in these spaces. Some argue that the separate chamber allowed women a degree of independence, a sphere where they could shape their own networks and exercise influence away from the king's constant gaze. Others insist the autonomy was limited, since every moment was still overseen by attendants and rituals. The truth, as usual, likely shifted depending on the queen herself. Some wielded their chambers as centers of power, others endured them as gilded cages. Close your eyes and imagine lying in this room. You are wrapped in layers of wool and fur, but the scents of herbs and perfumed oils soften the experience. The fire burns low, tended by a lady before she withdrew to her own pallet. The curtains close around you, muting the sounds of the castle. You feel both secure and constrained, watched yet comforted, a paradox of medieval royalty. The sensory details are vivid. You hear the quiet breathing of attendants on the floor nearby, the faint whimper of a dog shifting in its sleep. You smell the lingering sweetness of lavender crushed between sheets. You see the flicker of a single beeswax candle, its glow turning embroidered flowers into shimmering patterns on the canopy. It is not the smoky grandeur of the king's chamber, it is more personal, yet still steeped in ritual. One anecdote tells of a queen who invited her closest ladies into bed with her during especially cold winters, not out of impropriety, but simply for warmth and companionship. The image is striking: royalty curled among trusted women, whispering prayers and stories in the dark, human despite the weight of crowns. You realize that in such moments, queens experienced a nightly intimacy kings rarely permitted themselves. Academic discussion persists on whether these chambers were truly refuges or extensions of duty. Was the queen's bedchamber a place to rest, or another space for diplomacy, where ladies carried messages and brokered favors? Some evidence suggests both. The bed became a hub where feminine influence radiated outward, shaping politics from behind embroidered curtains. Now imagine dawn breaking. The queen rises with the help of her attendants. Prayers murmured, hair braided, jewels fastened. The intimacy of the night dissolves into ceremony once again. What seemed private was always semi-public. Every gesture observed, recorded, or remembered. The bedchamber was never hers alone. It belonged to the network of power she embodied. You step quietly back into the corridor, reflecting on the paradox. The Queen's chamber was gentler, more perfumed, more intimate, but it was no less political. Within its curtains lay both comfort and constraint, affection and duty, privacy and performance. And perhaps, in the long frozen winters, it offered one small consolation, a place where a woman could shape her own sphere of influence, even while wrapped in the furs of a kingdom. You leave behind the Queen's perfumed chamber and find yourself in a smaller side room filled with manuscripts, jars of dried herbs, and the faint odor of vinegar. This is no bedroom, but a reminder of how profoundly medieval medical theory shaped nightly life. To understand how kings and queens slept in winter, you must step into the strange world of humours, drafts, and remedies, the medical framework that governed everything from diet to dreams. One thing recorded again and again in medical treatises is the belief that cold air was dangerous. Physicians warned that night air could seep into the body, corrupting humours and opening the door to illness. Drafts were not just uncomfortable. They were thought to imbalance the system of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. For a monarch, whose health symbolized the health of the realm, avoiding such corruption became a matter of state importance. So chambers were arranged with that fear in mind. Beds were set away from walls to prevent the cold from creeping directly into the body. Curtains were drawn not only for warmth, but as barriers against invisible currents. Fires were carefully managed. Too much smoke could clog the lungs. Too little flame allowed harmful air to settle. The chamber itself was imagined as a body, needing balance and moderation. One curious prescription found in a 15th century medical text recommends placing bowls of warm spiced wine near the bed to purify the air. The rising vapor was thought to drive away noxious humours. Imagine a servant carefully balancing a steaming bowl of clove-scented liquid beside the monarch's pillow, the smell filling the chamber like a strange form of incense. Modern historians are still uncertain about how far these beliefs shaped daily practice. Some argue that royal households followed medical advice rigorously, employing physicians to dictate every detail of chamber life. Others think the prescriptions were more symbolic than practical, with attendants focusing instead on tangible comforts like blankets and furs. The lack of consistent records keeps the debate open, leaving us to wonder how much superstition governed actual sleep. Now picture the monarch preparing for bed. A physician hovers nearby, advising which herbs to burn, which foods to avoid before lying down, and how many logs should be placed on the fire. Perhaps the king is told to wear socks lined with rabbit fur, while the queen is instructed to sip warm possets flavored with nutmeg. The bed becomes a clinic as well as a sanctuary, its curtains closing around not just a body but a carefully curated regimen of health. The sensory details are striking. The air smells of rosemary and thyme scattered on the floor to ward off corruption. A faint sweetness of cloves lingers from spiced wine left steaming near the bed. The fire pops softly, its smoke weaving into the herbal haze. You hear the gentle prayers of attendants blending with whispered medical instructions, a chorus of devotion and science, if you can call humoral theory science. And here's a peculiar little fact that seems almost comical. Some texts advised placing live animals in chambers as natural heaters. Tiny lapdogs or even hens might have been tucked close to beds, their body heat considered a remedy against drafts. You can't help but smile at the thought of a queen drifting off while a chicken drowsed under her bed curtains, clucking softly in its sleep. But behind the humour lies the constant anxiety of illness. Medieval winters were not merely uncomfortable, they were perilous. Pneumonia, fevers, and chills could sweep through castles as easily as through peasant huts, and when the monarch fell ill, the kingdom trembled. Every precaution, no matter how odd, was worth attempting. Scholars still discuss whether the obsession with drafts was justified. Was it mere superstition, or did cold air in unventilated stone chambers genuinely contribute to illness? Some argue that the dampness and smoke, combined with chill, could indeed exacerbate respiratory problems. Others think the real danger lay in malnutrition and infection, not air itself. But to a medieval physician, the explanation was clear. Balance the humours, guard against draughts, and the royal body might endure another winter. Now slip beneath the imagined covers yourself. You smell rosemary sprigs stitched into the seams of blankets. You hear the faint bubbling of a pan of wine steaming on a trivet. You feel the odd comfort of wool socks, perhaps damp with sweat warmer than bare skin. And in the back of your mind lingers the fear that any shiver might herald disease. Sleep here is not pure rest. It is a nightly ritual of medical defense, a fragile hope against invisible dangers. Morning would begin with diagnosis as well. Physicians examined the monarch's complexion, checked the quality of sleep, even inspected urine for signs of imbalance. Dreams themselves were interpreted through humoral theory. Too much black bile might cause nightmares, while an excess of blood might lead to restless tossing. The very act of closing one's eyes was entangled with science, superstition, and symbolism. You step back into the corridor and breathe the cooler air, relieved to escape the haze of herbs and smoke. But you carry with you the realization that in medieval castles, sleep was never simple. It was a medicalized, ritualized act, shaped by fear of draughts and faith in balance. The monarch's body was a kingdom in miniature, guarded not only by soldiers and chamberlains, but by sprigs of rosemary and bowls of steaming spiced wine. You descend a narrow stair into a plainer wing of the castle. The air feels heavier here, and the floor is littered with straw. You are no longer in the gilded chamber of monarchs and queens, but in the spaces where their attendants rested. If the king's canopy was a fortress of fabric, this world was one of improvisation and proximity. Servants and guards often slept in the same room or just outside, their presence shaping the entire atmosphere of royal rest. Evidence from household ordinances and payrolls makes it clear that dozens of people lived cheek by jowl with the monarch each night. The chamberlains had pallets in corners, the guards leaned against doorframes, and lower servants unrolled bedding wherever there was floor space. Comfort was a privilege reserved for the royal body. For everyone else, sleep meant curling by the hearth or dozing upright in a chair. You imagine it vividly now. The king or queen tucked behind drawn curtains, while only a few feet away a page lies wrapped in a coarse wool blanket on the flagstones. The fire pops, its glow falling across weary faces. Someone shifts, someone coughs. The quiet is broken by a muttered prayer. Sleep here was never solitary. It was a communal act, layered with duty and fatigue. One colourful note from Chronicles describes guards sleeping upright against doors with halberds in hand, trained to wake at the slightest sound. Imagine the half-dreaming state, eyelids drooping but muscles tense, ears straining through the hush. These men slept not for themselves but for the monarch, their rest constantly balanced on vigilance. And here's a more unusual detail. Some attendants were known to sleep directly at the foot of the royal bed, curled like watchdogs. The symbolism is striking. Their bodies acted as barriers, their dreams interrupted by any stir from within the curtains. Imagine being so close that you could hear the monarch's breath, yet never cross into the intimacy of the bed. It was both honor and burden, loyalty written in exhaustion. Scholars still discuss how sustainable this communal arrangement really was. Some argue that such proximity was a necessity of security, ensuring that the monarch was never unprotected. Others suggest it was also about control, keeping attendants constantly within reach so that orders could be given at any hour. The debate continues. Were servants guardians of comfort or prisoners of obligation? Close your eyes and lie in one of those imagined pallets yourself. The straw shifts beneath your body. The blanket smells faintly of smoke, and the warmth from the fire fades the farther you stretch your toes. Your stomach growls from a half-meal eaten hours earlier. Around you, the steady breathing of others fills the chamber like waves. Above it all, You hear the faint creak of the royal canopy as the king turns in his sleep. You are close to power, yet endlessly far from it. The sensory elements are layered, the scratch of coarse fabric against your skin, the grit of straw poking through seams, the acrid smell of smoke that never quite leaves your nose. A faint draught slips under the door, brushing your face with icy fingers. You tug the blanket tighter, shivering, but exhaustion pulls you down regardless. Sleep in such conditions was not about comfort, but inevitability. One anecdote from a late medieval court tells of a servant who fell so deeply asleep beside the hearth that he rolled too close and singed his hair. The laughter of fellow attendants carried into the morning, but behind the humour lay the reality. Fatigue was constant, mistakes inevitable. Servants bore the brunt of endless labour by day and broken rest by night. Academic debate lingers over whether attendants ever truly resented this arrangement. Some historians argue they must have envied the monarch's heavy furs, longing for warmth while they shivered in shadows. Others point out that proximity to the royal bed also meant opportunity chance encounters, whispered favours, and potential advancement. A servant curled on the floor might still dream of power. Now imagine dawn breaking. A chamberlain stirs first, rousing others with a whisper. Pallets are rolled, blankets folded, the fire coaxed back to life. The monarch stretches behind curtains, attendants ready at once to assist. What was communal sleep transforms instantly into bustling service, the intimacy of night dissolving into the hierarchy of day. You step out of the chamber, your mind lingering on the strange intimacy of it all. Royal sleep was never solitary. It was watched, guarded, and surrounded by a chorus of weary bodies. The king and queen may have been swaddled in velvet, but their rest depended on dozens of exhausted attendants curled on stone floors. Power, it seems, always slept in company. You follow another staircase, one that spirals more tightly, leading to a quieter corner of the castle. Here, the stones feel older, the corridors more echoing. You push open a small wooden door and step into a chamber that feels haunted by sound rather than sight. This is the world of medieval night, an acoustic landscape alive with creaks, groans, and whispers. It was not silence that surrounded kings and queens at bedtime, but a chorus of noises that could unsettle even the bravest. One thing described in countless chronicles is that castles were never quiet. Timber beams shifted as they cooled, producing groans like low voices. Wind whistled through arrow slits and rattled shutters. Rats scurried in walls. Owls called outside. Dogs barked in courtyards. A monarch lying in bed, curtains drawn, would still be immersed in an uneasy soundscape that left little room for calm. You pause in the middle of the room and imagine it. The canopy curtains block the draught, but not the noise. Somewhere in the rafters above, you hear the flap of a bird disturbed from its roost. On the stairwell outside, a guard coughs, the sound echoing upward. Farther off, the clang of a chain against a gate repeats in the wind like an iron heartbeat. Sleep here required a stubborn will. A curious note appears in a 14th century household account. One queen requested a rotating staff of musicians to play softly in her chamber at night. Lutes, recorders, or voices humming psalms were meant to drown the unsettling creaks. Imagine drifting off not to silence but to the faint strains of melody, a lullaby not for a child but for a monarch who ruled empires. Scholars remain uncertain how effective such measures were. Some argue that constant noise from servants or musicians would have been more disturbing than soothing. Others believe the familiarity of soft sound masked the more alarming creaks of stone and timber. The disagreement reveals how subjective sleep must have been. What comforted one ruler might have kept another awake all night. Now picture yourself tucked beneath furs as the castle breathes and groans around you. The curtain muffles your sight, leaving your ears heightened. You hear the flutter of bats near the chimney, the snap of logs in the fire, the faint scrape of a mouse across stone. Every sound magnified by stillness, each one a reminder of how fragile security feels when darkness presses close. Oddly enough, some chronicles record monarchs waking in terror from imagined threats, phantoms, demons, or assassins conjured by the night's chorus. A rustle near the bed might be a servant shifting, but to a half-asleep mind, it could be an intruder with a blade. Night amplified fear, and castles with their echoes and drafts fed the imagination mercilessly. And yet, not all noises were unwelcome. Children sometimes slept near their royal parents, their soft breathing or murmured dreams filling the chamber with warmth. Attendants whispered prayers, their voices weaving like threads of reassurance. Even the crackle of a fire could soothe, its steady rhythm a heartbeat of safety in the midst of unease. The sensory experience becomes more vivid the longer you linger. You smell damp stone and burnt wood, but it is the sounds that dominate. A gust slams a shutter. A dog barks sharply before falling silent. The timber groans again, a long, low creak that makes you shift uneasily under covers. Perhaps you close your eyes tighter, hoping sleep will come before fear grows larger. One story often retold in Chronicles is of a king who kept a bell rope by his bedside. At the slightest suspicious sound, he could tug it and rouse guards throughout the castle. You can almost hear the clanging alarm echoing through halls, servants stumbling from pallets, soldiers seizing weapons. The precaution itself speaks volumes. No sound was too small to ignore. Modern historians disagree about how much night fear shaped medieval psychology. Some suggest it fostered a culture of superstition, where unexplained noises were attributed to spirits or devils. Others argue it was simply accepted as part of life, the natural background of stone architecture. Either way, the soundscape mattered. Kings and queens, no less than peasants, lay awake at times, listening, interpreting, fearing. Now put yourself once more in their place. You lie still, wrapped in wool and fur, eyes closed, ears open. Every creak feels magnified, every whisper heavy with possibility. You hear the shift of a servant nearby, then the faint clatter of armor as a guard moves outside. The castle seems alive, restless, unwilling to let you sink into peace. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow, punctuated by dreams where echoes and footsteps blur together. When dawn breaks, the noises shift again. Servants stir, dogs bark with purpose, and bells call the household to prayer. The night's whispers vanish, replaced by daytime clamor. But you remember the unease, the way shadows spoke through sound, the way even a king could feel powerless against a creaking timber in the dark. You step back into the corridor, ears ringing with imagined echoes, and you realize medieval nights were never silent. They were alive with sound, a constant reminder that castles, for all their grandeur, were fragile things in the presence of darkness. The corridor bends sharply and brings you into another chamber where the first thing you notice is the door itself. It is thick oak, reinforced with iron bands, and bristling with bolts. Beside it, on a stool, rests a set of heavy keys. You realize that for all the furs, curtains, and attendants, true safety in a medieval bedchamber depended on locks and barriers. Sleep could never come easily, if one suspected danger lurking beyond the threshold. We know from castle inventories and architectural remains that royal chambers were equipped with multiple locking systems. Doors were reinforced with thick timbers, sometimes double-layered, and secured by iron bars that slid into brackets on the wall. In some fortresses, the king's or queen's chamber was accessible only through a series of smaller anterooms, each with its own guard post and lock. Security was layered like the bed itself, heavy, complicated, designed to remind intruders they would be noticed long before reaching the royal body. Step closer to the imagined door, and you can feel the cold bite of iron. You picture a servant sliding a bolt across at night, the metallic thud echoing in the chamber. That sound must have been reassuring, a literal barrier drawn between ruler and threat. And yet, even that barrier was not absolute. Assassinations in bedrooms were not unknown, and the knowledge that no lock could guarantee safety must have lingered in every restless dream. One curious note appears in Chronicles of Edward II. It was said he often slept in different rooms, changing his location unexpectedly to avoid wood, be assassins. Imagine the disruption servants lugging bedding from chamber to chamber, attendants bewildered at where the king would settle that night. Paranoia, born from real threats, turned the nightly ritual of sleep into a strategic maneuver. There's also a strange, almost humorous story about a French noble who insisted on bolting his chamber from the inside, only to be trapped when the lock jammed. He spent hours banging on the door until servants broke it open. The laughter that followed, no doubt, masked real unease. What if fire had broken out? What if enemies had truly come? Locks gave safety but also carried the risk of entombment. Historians remain divided over how secure these bedchambers truly were. Some argue that the sheer number of guards and locked doors made royal assassination inside a castle nearly impossible. Others note that betrayals came from within, and all the bolts in the world could not prevent danger if a chamberlain or attendant turned traitor. The debate circles back to the same unsettling point. Safety was as much about loyalty as about locks. Now imagine yourself lying in that bed, curtains drawn, hearing the click of a bolt sliding into place. The fire hisses low, servants withdraw to their pallets, and you are left with the sound of your own breathing. You tell yourself you are safe, but every creak of the doorframe, every rattle of the shutter makes your muscles tighten. You know guards stand outside, but can you trust them? You know the chamberlain holds the key, but is he loyal? Sleep comes slowly, weighed down by suspicion. The sensory picture is vivid, the metallic chill of iron bolts, the smell of oiled wood as doors are maintained, the echo of footsteps fading down the corridor as the last servant leaves. The silence is not silence at all. It is a waiting pause, the stillness of a house that could at any moment burst into commotion. Another oddity appears in some records. Rulers sometimes kept weapons at their bedsides, daggers or swords within easy reach. You can almost see a queen's jeweled dagger laid on the table beside a prayer book, a curious pairing of faith and fear. It suggests that even behind heavy locks, royalty never abandoned vigilance. Academic discussions often frame this as a paradox. Bedchambers were the most secure spaces in castles, yet they were also the most vulnerable. The ruler was defenseless once asleep, and every lock was only as strong as the loyalty of those who held the keys. Scholars argue whether the elaborate security routines brought real peace of mind, or whether they simply emphasized the danger, making sleep more anxious. Now, put yourself in that uneasy place. You curl under blankets, your nightcap pulled low, a dagger resting close by. Outside the curtains, attendants breathe softly. Beyond the door, a guard shifts his weight, chainmail clinking faintly. Every sound magnifies in the dark, the groan of a timber, the hiss of the fire, the rattle of wind against shutters. You wait for danger that never comes, until at last exhaustion drags you into uneasy dreams. When dawn arrives, bolts are drawn back with a screech of iron. Attendants file in, cheerful voices announcing the morning. The fear of the night fades quickly, swallowed by ritual and routine. Yet in the back of your mind you remember it, the uneasy knowledge that no matter how thick the door or how many bolts are drawn, sleep is always a gamble. You step back into the corridor, leaving the heavy door closed behind you, and you understand, in the medieval castle, security was never absolute. Locks, guards, and loyalty formed a fragile web around the royal bed, one that could hold or shatter at any moment. Sleep, for all its rituals, was always shadowed by danger. The next passage takes you not to a royal chamber, but into a cloistered wing attached to the castle's chapel. The walls here are stark, the air cooler, the atmosphere quieter. You realize this is a different kind of sleeping world altogether. Monastic quarters, where the rhythms of prayer and austerity shaped how men and women of God endured winter nights. For kings and queens, the proximity of monasteries and chapels often meant constant comparison. Their own chambers seemed extravagant when measured against the strict simplicity of monastic sleep. From monastic rules like the Benedictine Regula, we know that monks were expected to rest communally in long dormitories. Privacy was rare. Rows of beds or pallets lined the hall, sometimes divided only by thin partitions or curtains. The emphasis was on equality. No single monk's bed was meant to be better than another. Warmth was minimal. Straw mattresses, simple woolen blankets, and perhaps a cloak pulled over the shoulders were all that shielded them from the chill. You pause in the imagined dormitory now. The room smells of straw, wax, and human breath. Windows are narrow, shutters creaking in the wind. A single candle burns at the far end, more symbolic than useful. Silence is demanded, though coughs and sighs punctuate the stillness. The cold presses against everybody equally, a reminder that in this life, humility extended even to sleep. One detail from Cistercian houses stands out. Monks were often required to sleep in their habits, ready to rise instantly for the midnight vigils. Imagine the scratch of coarse wool against bare skin, the tightness of a belt around your waist as you lay on straw. Comfort was sacrificed for readiness, the body treated as a tool for devotion rather than a vessel for luxury. Curiously, records from some nunneries show a small allowance for extra coverings in bitter winters, wool hoods, or fur-lined mantles. You can picture sisters huddling under layers, their prayers whispered through chattering teeth. Even here, hierarchy crept in. Abbesses sometimes enjoyed thicker blankets, though still modest by royal standards. Scholars continue to debate how strongly monastic practice influenced royal life. Some argue that kings and queens, conscious of religious ideals, occasionally adopted austere habits in their chambers, limiting luxury, favoring wool over silk, or sleeping with fewer attendants during seasons of penance. Others insist that royal households rarely imitated true austerity, preferring ceremony over sacrifice. The truth may lie in the symbolism. By acknowledging monastic sleep, monarchs reinforced their connection to piety while rarely embracing its discomfort fully. Now picture the contrast. You step back into a royal chamber after imagining the dormitory. There, furs pile thick, fires burn brighter, attendants hover to ensure warmth. And yet, in the minds of kings and queens, the image of monks shivering on straw beds lingered as a reminder. Perhaps it eased their guilt to know others lived in such devotion. Perhaps it justified their own luxury, framed as necessary for rulers rather than optional for ascetics. The sensory shift is dramatic. In the dormitory, you hear the rustle of straw, the murmur of Latin chants rising before dawn, the shuffle of bare feet across stone. In the royal chamber, you hear whispered counsel, the hiss of braziers, the rustle of silk curtains. Both worlds endured cold, but one embraced it as discipline while the other fought it with wealth. An unusual anecdote survives from the chronicles of King Louis IX of France, remembered for his piety. He sometimes insisted on sleeping on straw during Lent, even as his courtiers enjoyed feather mattresses. It scandalized some attendants and impressed others, but it highlights the way monastic ideals occasionally invaded royal practice. Whether he slept soundly is another matter entirely. Modern experts remain divided. Did such gestures reflect genuine discomfort, or were they symbolic performances staged for moral authority? Perhaps both. Either way, the image of a monarch embracing monastic austerity for a season added weight to the idea that rulers shared in the trials of their people. Now place yourself in the monastic dormitory. You lie on straw, wrapped in a coarse blanket, your breath forming mist in the air. Around you, rows of others breathe in unison, their snores and sighs creating a strange harmony. The bell will ring soon, calling you to rise in darkness for prayer. Sleep is shallow, fragmented, shaped by devotion. You doze, wake, doze again, always aware of the cold. Then imagine stepping from that into the Queen's perfumed chamber once more. The shock is profound. Furs heavy on your chest, the warmth of embers glowing, curtains closing you into privacy. The contrast itself becomes part of the narrative of power. Rulers had what monks renounced, yet both worlds claimed legitimacy through their choices. As you leave this imagined dormitory behind, you understand something deeper. Royal sleep was luxurious, yes, but it always carried the shadow of monastic austerity, a reminder that in the eyes of the Church, true devotion lay not in velvet, but in straw. In winter especially, the comparison must have been sharp, each cold night pressing the contrast into sharper relief. You cross into another part of the castle, one that smells faintly different even in imagination. Here, the walls gleam with imported hangings, and the floors are softened by woven carpets that clearly did not originate from Northern Europe. This chamber speaks not just of comfort, but of trade, of global networks stretched across oceans and deserts. Kings and queens did not endure the cold winters with wool alone. They adorned their beds with exotic imports that shouted wealth to every visitor. We know from royal inventories that silks from Byzantium, carpets from the Levant, and furs from the far north all found their way into European chambers. These were not everyday textiles. They were treasures carried across dangerous routes, purchased at enormous expense. To drape a bed with silk hangings was to say, without words, that one's reach extended across continents. Sleep itself became a declaration of empire. Step closer to the imagined bed, and you see curtains shimmering faintly, dyed with deep indigo or crimson that local weavers could rarely replicate. The embroidery glitters with gold threads, each stitch a sign of costly labor. Beneath your feet, a rug spreads across the stone floor, its patterns geometric, foreign, mesmerizing. Imagine the astonishment of a visiting noble, stepping from icy draughts into a chamber warmed not only by fire, but by the illusion of distant lands stitched into fabric. One curious record mentions that ermine pelts, imported from northern forests, were considered essential for royal bedding. Their white fur, speckled with black tails, symbolized purity and power. Monarchs sometimes lay beneath entire coverlets of ermine, the pelts stitched together so that the sleeper was swaddled in a garment of symbolism as much as warmth. You can almost feel the silky smoothness beneath your fingertips, though you also wonder about the dozens of tiny animals required to produce such luxury. And then there is the quirkier side. Some chronicles describe rulers insisting on silk sheets, despite the fact that silk clung uncomfortably to skin in cold weather. Imagine sliding into bed, expecting warmth, only to find the fabric chilling rather than insulating. Yet the symbolism of silk outweighed practicality. It was less about comfort and more about spectacle, the statement that the king or queen could afford such finery. Experts remain divided on how widely such imports were actually used. Some argue they were reserved for ceremonial display, brought out when visitors might witness the royal bed. Others believe monarchs used them regularly, indulging in the rarest comforts even when no eyes watched. The disagreement reflects a deeper question. Was exotic bedding a genuine tool of warmth, or was it merely another theatrical layer in the performance of monarchy? Now imagine yourself lying beneath these imports. The silk feels smooth against your skin but offers little insulation. Above you, curtains embroidered with Eastern patterns ripple faintly in the draught. Beneath you, a rug muffles the cold of stone, its weave dense, its colors rich. You shift and catch the faint smell of spices lingering in the fibers, perhaps saffron or musk carried with the cloth from far-off markets. Sleep here is not only physical but symbolic. You are cradled by the world, enveloped in the spoils of trade. The sensory landscape is remarkable. The fire glows, its light bouncing off golden threads in hangings. The smell of exotic furs mixes with wood smoke, creating an air heavy with wealth. You hear the soft rustle of silk as you turn, the muffled thud of footsteps on a carpet that deadens echoes. Even the air feels different, cushioned by the presence of fabric. One amusing anecdote appears in the writings of a Venetian merchant who claimed that an English queen complained of sneezing fits when lying under imported carpets used as blankets. Perhaps the dust of long travel clung to the weave, or perhaps the story was told to mock extravagance. Either way, it captures the odd reality. Luxury was not always practical. Scholarly debate persists on how these imports shaped medieval ideas of kingship. Some argue that such textiles were a form of soft power, impressing foreign ambassadors more than stone walls ever could. Others see them as wasteful indulgence, criticized by moralists who compared royal luxury unfavorably to monastic austerity. Both views hold truth. Wealth displayed in sleep chambers was both admired and resented. Picture dawn in this imported chamber. Attendants draw back silk curtains, the fabric catching the first light like fire. The monarch rises, their feet sinking briefly into the plushness of a rug brought from far beyond Europe. Every movement is surrounded by reminders of power and reach. Even in winter's coldest months, the chamber declares, the world itself wraps this body in warmth. You step away, the shimmer of silk and the scent of musk lingering in your imagination, and you realize that medieval sleep was not just about survival, it was about spectacle. The royal bed was a stage upon which global wealth performed, turning icy castles into showcases of empire. You wander into another chamber, and this one feels different from the start. It isn't the size of the bed, nor the richness of the hangings, but the faint objects left scattered around. Charms stitched into cloth, tiny relics set in ivory boxes, crosses etched into bedposts. Here, sleep was never simply physical. It was a moment of spiritual vulnerability, a liminal crossing into a night filled with invisible dangers. For kings and queens, whose bodies symbolized the realm, such dangers were no small matter. We know from devotional manuals and accounts of household rituals that medieval people feared the night as a time when demons, spirits, and nightmares prowled. Beds became fortified not only with furs and curtains but with prayer and magic. A monarch might have a crucifix hung at the bed's head, a rosary tucked under a pillow, or a saint's relic placed on a bedside table. These were protections as essential as locks and guards. Picture the scene. The queen kneels at her prie-dieu, whispering evening prayers, then slips a small lead token of Saint Catherine under her mattress. The king crosses himself before extinguishing the last candle, muttering charms taught by confessors to ward off evil dreams. Curtains are drawn not only against drafts but against spirits thought to slip through shadows. To us, it might sound superstitious. To them, it was survival. And here is a curious note. Some households sprinkled holy water on beds before the monarch lay down. Imagine attendants moving solemnly around the chamber, flicking droplets across furs and sheets, the smell of sanctity mixing with the musk of wool. It wasn't just about warmth, it was about purity, cleansing the place where body and soul would lie defenseless. One especially odd practice survives in a 14th century text. People sometimes placed knives or iron tools near the bed to ward off demons. The belief was that iron repelled malign forces. You smile at the image of a queen lying beneath silk sheets while, just out of sight, a kitchen knife lay hidden under her pillow not for assassins, but for spirits. Scholars still wrestle with the degree to which royalty truly believed in such protections. Some argue that monarchs, deeply pious, took these rituals as seriously as any villager. Others suggest that rulers performed them more for symbolism, demonstrating their devotion to reassure subjects and church alike. The truth likely blended both, belief and performance interwoven as tightly as the embroidery on their bed curtains. Now imagine lying there yourself. You feel the cool linen sheets beneath your hands, the faint dampness where holy water touched fabric. You smell beeswax from the extinguished candle, mingled with rosemary sachets tucked near the pillow. Your fingers brush the small edge of a reliquary hidden under cloth. As you close your eyes, the fire hisses in the hearth, and you whisper a final prayer. Fear does not vanish, but it lessens. Ritual soothes. The sensory world is full of contrast. Sacred objects glow faintly in candlelight, yet the shadows beyond the curtains feel deeper, alive. The smell of incense lingers from prayers said earlier, mixing with smoke. You hear a servant outside reciting a psalm, his voice carrying softly through the door. Even in silence, the room feels inhabited by saints, by symbols, by unseen guardians. One quirky story recorded by chroniclers tells of a king who insisted on having relics sewn directly into his bedclothes. Over time, the relics frayed fabric, and annoyed attendants tasked with repairs. But the king refused to part with them, convinced they protected his dreams from evil visions. It's almost comic, yet it reveals how profoundly rulers treated sleep as a vulnerable threshold. And still, debate lingers among historians. Was this fear of night spirits primarily religious? Or was it cultural, a way to give form to the very real unease of sleeping in smoky, creaking castles? Some scholars argue the rituals were psychological, soothing anxieties born of draughts and noises. Others insist that piety itself drove practice, that kings and queens truly believed demons lurked at the bed's edge. The disagreement persists, as murky as the shadows of a medieval night. Now slip again into that role. You lie beneath layers of fur, your breath fogging the air. At your side rests a crucifix. At your feet a charm stitched into the bedspread. You hear the mutter of attendants outside the curtains, the soft padding of a dog shifting near the hearth. The castle creaks, wind whistles, but you cling to the sense that unseen guardians keep watch. Sleep comes not because the room is warm, but because it has been fortified with prayer and symbol. When dawn breaks, the first light touches relics on the table, glinting faintly. The queen's token is retrieved, the king's charm set back into its case, and attendants whisper prayers of thanks. Night has been survived, not only through blankets and fires, but through faith. You step out of the chamber, leaving behind its faint aura of incense and secrecy, and you realize, for medieval royalty, sleep was never merely physical rest. It was a spiritual crossing, a nightly battle against invisible forces, fought with crucifixes, charms, and whispered words in the dark. You climb back toward the upper levels of the keep, where the air grows colder again, and you step into a chamber that looks almost deserted. The hearth here is little more than a hollow in the wall, the bed smaller, the curtains thinner. Yet this is no servant's corner. This is a reminder that in some castles, especially during long winters, kings and queens abandoned their grand ceremonial rooms to occupy smaller, warmer chambers tucked deep within the walls. Surviving building plans show that many castles contained inner chambers, or closets, attached to the great bedchambers. These were narrow, insulated spaces where heat could be trapped more effectively. The grand canopy bed might remain for display, but the actual sleep sometimes took place in what looks, to modern eyes, like a modest side room. The logic was simple. Less space meant less cold. Step inside this imagined room and notice how the walls close around you. The ceiling is lower, the door smaller, and the hearth surprisingly close to the bed. Smoke curls up the chimney, warming the chamber more efficiently than in the vast halls. You can almost feel relief here. At last, a space where the fire makes a real difference. One record from the Burgundian court describes how a duke preferred to sleep in such an inner closet during January, while keeping his ceremonial bedchamber on display to visitors. Imagine the dual existence. One bed of velvet and ermine to show the world, another plainer but warmer bed, where real rest was possible. The split reveals the paradox of royal life: image for the public, practicality for the private. And here's a curious little note. In some castles, these side rooms were so small that attendants could barely squeeze in. Servants sometimes slept just outside the door, ready to respond if called, but unable to crowd inside. The monarch, for once, enjoyed a sliver of privacy, though it came at the price of cramped quarters. Experts remain divided on how common this practice really was. Some argue that most monarchs spent winters in these smaller heated closets, abandoning the grand chambers entirely. Others insist it was the exception, that ritual and display demanded the monarch remain visible, even at night. The uncertainty lingers, a reminder of how easily practical realities slip out of the historical record. Now imagine yourself lying in this inner chamber. The bed is smaller, the covers fewer, but the warmth is immediate. The fire's glow reaches you without needing to cross a cavernous space. The walls trap heat instead of bleeding it away. You shift under blankets and feel, for the first time in this journey, something approaching real comfort. Yet even here, The door creaks when a guard shifts outside, reminding you that privacy was never complete. The sensory details sharpen. You smell the sharper tang of smoke, thicker in a confined space. You hear the hiss of logs catching flame, louder because the room is so small. You see light bouncing across close stone walls, the shadows less grand but more intimate. The warmth of the fire finally seeps into your bones, though it also leaves the air stuffy. You tug your nightcap lower and breathe deeply, grateful for heat if not for freshness. One amusing anecdote describes a nobleman who so enjoyed his heated closet that he refused to return to his great chamber for weeks, forcing attendants to hold court in a space barely large enough for 4 people. The chronicler noted, with sly humour, that politics carried on among the bedposts and boots, as though even governance had been shrunk by the confines of the room. The scholarly discussion here focuses on symbolism versus practicality. Was the shift to inner chambers an admission that castles failed to provide true comfort, or was it a clever adaptation, a sign of ingenuity? Some argue it undermined royal majesty, reducing kings to creatures huddling for warmth. Others insist it showed resilience, the ability to adapt without losing face. The lack of consensus reminds you that history often balances between perception and reality. Slip back into the bed once more. You lie curled tightly, the covers drawn close. The fire pops, sending warmth across your face, but the rest of the chamber feels thick with smoke. You cough lightly, then drift toward sleep anyway, soothed by the nearness of the fire. Outside, guards shift uneasily, listening for movement. For a few short hours, warmth triumphs over grandeur. Morning here looks different too. There are no grand curtains to fling back, no parade of courtiers. Instead, a few attendants step quietly inside, helping you dress quickly before leading you back to the ceremonial bedchamber for appearances. The secret of the night remains hidden. That true sleep came not in the hall of velvet and gold, but in this narrow closet warmed by fire. You step out into the corridor again, glancing back at the modest chamber, and you realize medieval royalty lived double lives in winter, one for display, one for survival. The public bed was theatre, the private bed was necessity. Between the two lay the fragile truth of royal humanity. You follow another narrow passage, this time toward a chamber that surprises you with its abundance of small wooden doors. Each leads not to the outside but to tiny alcoves and hidden spaces tucked within the thick castle walls. You realize you've stepped into the world of storage and supply the quiet backbone of nightly comfort. Royal sleep in winter wasn't only about the bed itself, but about the endless movement of supplies that made survival possible. Royal accounts list staggering numbers of blankets, mattresses, and sheets kept in constant rotation. Wool had to be aired to prevent mildew, furs brushed to keep vermin at bay, feathers replaced when they clumped. Servants stored these textiles in chests lined with cedar or sprinkled with herbs like lavender and thyme. Imagine the bustle at dusk, attendants hauling fresh linens, shaking out quilts in smoky air, layering bed after bed so that, by the time the monarch arrived, it looked effortless. Step closer in your imagination to one of these storage chests. The wood smells sharp, spiced faintly with resin. Open it, and you find folded sheets of linen, their edges embroidered with dynastic symbols. Beneath them lie woolen blankets dyed in deep reds and greens, the colors now faded but still rich. At the very bottom rests a fur covering, fox or sable, its sheen dull in the low light. The sheer volume overwhelms you, luxury built on repetition, every night demanding fresh preparation. A fascinating account survives from the household of Mary of Burgundy, where attendants rotated bedding weekly, carting soiled linens to laundresses who boiled them with lye and ash. It was laborious, smelly work, but vital. Imagine the smoke rising from great cauldrons outside the castle walls, the air pungent with soapwort and steam. Clean bedding was as much about status as comfort, proof that royalty did not wallow in filth, even if the effort was monumental. And here's a quirky note. Some records suggest beds were sometimes stuffed with aromatic herbs, not only for fragrance but to repel lice and fleas. Imagine lying down at night and catching the faint prickly scent of mint or pennyroyal, tucked beneath the sheets as invisible guardians. The thought is charming, though you suspect the itch of straw poking through fabric was never entirely conquered. Historians remain divided on how effective these measures really were. Some argue that careful laundering and herbal sachets kept royal beds relatively free of vermin, a rare luxury in the medieval world. Others believe infestations were inevitable, that even kings and queens scratched through the night despite all precautions. The absence of definitive evidence keeps the question alive, a reminder that even the mightiest were still flesh and blood. Now imagine the routine from the servant's perspective. Hours before the monarch arrived, you carried a heavy mattress from storage, fluffed the feather bed, shook out the blankets and tucked herbs into seams. You worked with others to drape the curtains, smooth the sheets, and ensure the chamber smelled of cleanliness rather than smoke. By the time the royal figure entered, everything gleamed. Yet your body ached, your clothes reeked of soap and damp wool. The comfort of one required the exhaustion of many. The sensory picture fills the chamber. The musty smell of old wool, the sweetness of lavender sachets, the acrid tang of boiled lye. You hear the thud of chests closing, the rustle of fabric unfolding, the chatter of servants hurrying to finish before nightfall. You touch the coarse weave of linen, smoother than peasant cloth but still stiff, warmed by the fire's heat. One amusing anecdote from a 15th century castle inventory lists 2 spare mattresses and 1 broken bolster, not to be used for guests of rank. The detail makes you smile. Even in palaces, there were categories of bedding, the finest for royalty, middling for noble visitors, and shabby caste, offs for lesser folk. Sleep itself became a ladder of hierarchy, measured in feathers and furs. Scholarly discussion continues about the scale of these operations. Some argue that constant laundering and rotation was evidence of advanced household management, a sign of growing sophistication in late medieval courts. Others suggest it was haphazard, dependent on seasons, supplies, and local labor. What is clear is that behind every warm night for a monarch stood dozens of invisible workers, scrubbing, sewing, and carrying. Now place yourself once more in that bed, after the linens have been freshly changed. The sheets are cool against your skin, scented faintly with rosemary. The blankets are heavy, layered in careful sequence. The furs lie thick across your chest. You sigh with relief, even as you know that tomorrow the process will begin again, servants hauling, washing, and storing. Comfort is never permanent. It must be manufactured nightly, renewed by labor. At dawn, attendants will strip the bed, fold the linens, and carry them off to be cleaned. The cycle repeats endlessly, invisible to all but those who work it. Yet for the monarch, the effect is simple. Each night, the bed feels fresh, the chamber smells clean, and sleep, though still cold and draughty, comes a little easier. You step back into the corridor and glance once more at the storage alcoves, and you realize medieval kings and queens did not sleep alone. They slept on the backs of servants, laundresses, weavers, and hunters, whose endless labor filled chests with warmth. Every blanket was a chain in the machinery of survival, every sheet a link between power and toil. You wander farther down a long gallery, past tall windows shuttered against the winter wind. At the end, a chamber opens that feels unusually airy, lined with large arched windows now covered with wooden boards. You sense that this room was never meant for deep winter rest. Yet here it is a reminder of the tension between luxury and practicality. Castles were built to impress, and their grandest chambers often betrayed their owners during the coldest months. Contemporary descriptions reveal that the largest rooms, sometimes called great chambers or solar apartments, were designed for ceremony more than comfort. High ceilings displayed wealth, vast fireplaces impressed visitors, and multiple windows let in streams of light, But in winter, these same features turned chambers into frozen caves. Heat rose toward rafters, windows leaked drafts, and stone absorbed every ember. Kings and queens who insisted on sleeping in such spaces faced long, restless nights despite all their furs and curtains. Step into the imagined chamber and notice the contrast. The bed is colossal, its canopy soaring like a small roof. The fireplace yawns wide, its flames flickering against stone, but the air beyond its reach is icy. Curtains ripple as invisible currents slip past shutters. You draw your cloak tighter and realize that grandeur itself carried a price. Space that looked magnificent, but bled warmth at every seam. One intriguing account comes from the household of Richard II, whose palace at Sheen boasted magnificent large windows. Chroniclers noted that in winter these windows turned his chambers bitterly cold, forcing attendants to layer extra hangings and furs. Imagine the irony. The very architectural marvels that proclaimed majesty also condemned their own to shivering nights. There's even a quirky anecdote from a French courtier who complained that sleeping in a royal hall felt like lying in a cathedral of frost. He described his beard stiff with ice by dawn, despite layers of blankets. The remark makes you laugh softly, yet it underscores how fragile warmth was in these spaces. Scholars continue to debate whether monarchs truly endured these conditions regularly. Some argue that kings and queens often retreated to smaller closets in winter, leaving the grand chambers for show. Others maintain that ceremony required visible endurance, that part of royal image was demonstrating fortitude by sleeping in public splendor despite the cold. The truth is likely a mixture: symbolic nights in the grand hall, practical nights elsewhere. Now imagine yourself in that grand room. You climb into the enormous bed, pulling furs across your body, the curtains closed tight. The fire glows faintly across the chamber, but drafts still nip at your face. You shift, pull the covers higher, but every movement releases another trickle of icy air. Sleep becomes an act of endurance, the majesty of your surroundings mocking the vulnerability of your body. The sensory atmosphere overwhelms. The smell of smoke is faint here, dispersed by the cavernous space. The sound of wind slipping through shutters is constant, a low whistle that never fades. The sight of high ceilings, beams vanishing into shadow, makes you feel small beneath your own canopy. The cold touches everything: stone floor, bedpost, even the air you exhale, visible in misty puffs. One peculiar adaptation noted in some accounts was the use of secondary fires placed in braziers around the room. Servants moved quietly at intervals to replenish them, creating little islands of warmth. But even then, the space swallowed heat. You picture attendants shuffling with coal pans, the glow of embers scattered like stars in a dark sky, their warmth never quite reaching the bed. Modern historians remain divided on how much this grandeur affected health. Some argue that the cold in such chambers contributed to recurring illnesses, draining vitality. Others suggest that rulers simply accepted it, their bodies hardened by years of exposure. The lack of definitive evidence means we're left to imagine the constant negotiation between majesty and misery. Now place yourself there again. You roll over, fur heavy, curtains drawn, but a draught still finds you. You dream fitfully, disturbed by the whistle of wind and the groan of beams. When you wake, frost clings to the inside of shutters, and your breath lingers white in the air. You shiver, realizing that even surrounded by wealth, you have spent the night in a frozen monument. At dawn, attendants fling open the curtains, revealing your disheveled hair, red nose, and weary eyes. Yet to courtiers who bow low, the spectacle is unchanged. The monarch has risen from a bed of state, surrounded by magnificence. The truth of the night remains hidden, swallowed by ceremony. You step back into the corridor and glance once more at the vast chamber, and you realize medieval kings and queens often slept in rooms designed more for appearances than for warmth. Winter nights here were trials of endurance disguised as grandeur. To occupy such a bed was to prove not only majesty but also resilience, a nightly reminder that power carried its own form of discomfort. The passage turns again, and you find yourself in a smaller, quieter hall where the air feels almost warmer, though the fireplace is long dead. It dawns on you that not every royal night was passed alone with furs, fire, and whispered prayers. Sometimes kings and queens chose out of custom, out of necessity, or out of sheer survival to share their beds with others. Not always in the way scandalous tales suggest, but in arrangements that blurred lines between intimacy, politics, and practicality. From chronicles and court ordinances, we know that bed sharing was not unusual in the medieval world. Even among nobles, it was common for two or more individuals to sleep in the same bed. Privacy was rare, and warmth was precious. For monarchs, the practice carried multiple meanings, sometimes ceremonial, sometimes practical, sometimes strategic. A shared bed was never just a place of sleep. It was a living symbol of alliance, affection, or necessity. Picture the royal bed in winter, its curtains drawn, its furs piled high. Now imagine another body beneath those covers. A spouse, of course, but also at times a child, a favored attendant, or even a visiting dignitary. Such intimacy shocks modern sensibilities, but to medieval rulers it was part of the fabric of life. One fact preserved in household accounts is that children of kings and queens occasionally slept in their parents' chambers, sometimes even in the royal bed, until they were considered old enough for their own attendance. Imagine the little body of a prince curled between velvet and fur, his small breaths mingling with those of his parents. The presence provided warmth, yes, but also a reminder that dynasties were flesh before they were lineage. And then there are the stranger notes, ambassadors recorded, with a mixture of awe and discomfort, being invited to share a bed with royalty or nobility as a sign of trust. To lie beside someone was the ultimate gesture of confidence. Yet one can only picture the awkwardness, the shuffle of limbs, the forced casualness, the unspoken tension of diplomacy played out under blankets. Scholars continue to debate the frequency and meaning of such arrangements. Some insist that bed sharing among royalty was mostly symbolic, used in specific ceremonies of trust. Others argue that the practice was genuinely practical in icy winters, when a second body meant real survival against the cold. Both views may be right. The evidence suggests variability, sometimes ceremony, sometimes necessity. Now imagine yourself as the monarch on a bitter January night. You lie under fur covers, and a trusted attendant settles on the outer edge of the bed to keep watch. The heat radiates, doubling your comfort, but the presence is both soothing and claustrophobic. You turn and hear the faint rustle of fabric, the sigh of another body drifting into dreams. Privacy vanishes, yet warmth blooms. The sensory experience is striking. The bed feels narrower, though its frame is wide. The covers are heavier with two sets of limbs shifting beneath them. The air smells of shared breath, wool, and perhaps spiced wine consumed before lying down. The fire crackles faintly, but it is the warmth of the person beside you that truly shields you from the draught creeping under the curtains. One amusing anecdote tells of a noble who shared a bed with a king on campaign, and later boasted of it as though it were the highest of honours. He described, with comic frankness, how the monarch snored so loudly that he considered stuffing his ears with wool. The story circulated as both flattery and joke, proof that even shared sleep could ripple into courtly gossip. Academic arguments circle around the political uses of bed sharing. Was it a tool of intimacy, forging bonds stronger than oaths? Or was it simply the pragmatic continuation of a custom common to all classes? Some historians lean towards symbolism, pointing out how often chroniclers highlighted bed sharing in tales of diplomacy. Others stress practicality after all. Even kings got cold, and no amount of fur rivaled another human body. Now slip into that imagined night again. You roll slightly and bump against another shoulder. For a moment you feel irritation. This is your bed, your chamber, your furs. But then the warmth returns, the shared presence soothing in the dark. You close your eyes and drift into sleep, knowing that in the morning, attendants will bow as if nothing happened, as though the intimacy of the night never existed. When dawn breaks, the symbolism reasserts itself. To have shared the bed of a king or queen is to claim closeness beyond measure. The attendant or guest rises with pride, the memory of warmth transformed into currency at court. For the monarch, the night becomes another tool of power, intimacy converted into politics. You step back into the corridor, the air colder now that you've left the shared warmth behind, and you understand, medieval royalty did not always sleep alone. Sometimes they surrendered privacy for trust, sometimes for ceremony, sometimes for simple survival. Each shared bed was a knot of warmth, politics, and vulnerability, woven into the fabric of winter nights in stone castles. You move along another winding gallery, and this time the air seems to grow thinner, as though carrying the weight of ritual. You find yourself in a chamber smaller than the grand halls, but arranged with curious care. Bowls of water rest on stools, folded cloths lie neatly stacked, and a prie-dieu kneeling bench waits near the bed. Here, you step into the world of nightly rituals, the small, repeated acts that prepared kings and queens for sleep. These were gestures of faith, cleanliness, and symbolism, each layered with meaning. From household ordinances and devotional manuals, we know that monarchs rarely tumbled into bed without ceremony. Servants brought basins of warmed water, often scented with herbs, for the ruler to wash hands and face. This was not simply hygiene, it was believed that cleansing the body also cleansed the soul before rest. Imagine the monarch dipping fingers into the basin, steam rising faintly, the water catching torchlight as attendants offered cloths. Afterward came prayers. Queens and kings knelt beside their beds, sometimes alone, sometimes joined by chaplains or ladies in waiting. Psalms were murmured, the Pater Noster recited, and sometimes entire litanies spoken softly in candlelight. The act was both devotion and performance, an intimate ritual watched by attendants who carried stories back into the wider household. One well-recorded fact is that monarchs often made the sign of the cross over their bed before lying down. The gesture sanctified the space, marking the bed not only as furniture but as a temporary altar of the body. Curtains were drawn afterward with care, as though sealing the sanctity inside. And then there are the quirks that add texture. Some accounts mention rulers drinking possets before bed, warm milk or wine, spiced with nutmeg or cinnamon. The mixture was thought to aid digestion and calm the body for sleep. Picture a king sipping slowly from a silver cup while servants hovered, waiting for the signal to withdraw. The flavor was heavy, sweet, and soothing, the medieval equivalent of a nightcap in more ways than one. Historians continue to discuss the exact purpose of these nightly rituals. Were they primarily religious, reinforcing the monarch's image as pious protector of the realm? Or were they pragmatic, small comforts meant to coax weary bodies into rest? Some argue for both that religion and comfort were so entwined that separating them is impossible. The debate lingers, unresolved, like the faint fragrance of herbs in a steaming basin. Now imagine yourself stepping into that role. You dip your hands into warm water, the heat loosening tension from cold, stiffened fingers. You dry them on embroidered linen, soft and faintly scented with lavender. You kneel at the prie-dieu, murmuring familiar words while the fire pops behind you. Your body leans into rhythm, repetition calming the mind. The night still waits, heavy and cold, but you feel lighter, cleansed, prepared. The sensory details fill the chamber, the soft slosh of water in basins, the fragrance of herbs rising with steam, the faint creak of wood as you kneel. Candles flicker, casting small halos of light across painted saints on the wall. The taste of spiced milk lingers on your tongue, warming throat and belly. You crawl into bed wrapped in the aura of ritual, as though faith itself were a blanket. One unusual anecdote describes a queen who insisted her attendants recite a lullaby-like prayer aloud while she drifted into sleep. The words repeated rhythmically, almost chant-like, until her breathing deepened. It is strangely tender, suggesting that even the most powerful sometimes craved the simple comfort of sound at bedtime. Scholars have argued whether these rituals were genuinely effective for sleep or whether they were more about projection. Was the monarch praying out of faith or out of habit performed for others' eyes? The truth may not matter. What mattered was the act itself, repeated nightly, creating continuity between days of chaos and nights of rest. Now picture the chamber after the ritual's end. The attendants withdraw, the basin of water is carried away, and silence returns. You lie under furs, your body tingling faintly from warmth and prayer. Outside the curtains, the world is still cold and dangerous, but inside them, you are wrapped not only in fabric but in habit, tradition, and belief. Ritual becomes shield. At dawn, the cycle reverses. Attendants bring basins again, this time for washing away sleep. Morning prayers replace evening litanies. The cup of posset is replaced with bread or spiced ale. What was sanctified at night is renewed in daylight. The rhythm continues, unbroken, stitching life together with gestures that were as much about the soul as about the skin. You step back into the corridor, leaving behind the quiet sanctity of ritual, and you realize medieval kings and queens did not simply fall asleep. They were ushered into rest by prayer, water, words, and symbols. Sleep was not absence but ceremony, a nightly passage from power to vulnerability, framed by faith and performance alike. You follow another twisting stair that leads into a long gallery lined with portraits. Their painted faces seem to watch you as you walk, reminding you that royal sleep was never purely private. It was always watched, recorded, and remembered. And here, in this chamber, you come face to face with the way winter nights in bed shaped public image. For kings and queens, the bed itself could become a stage where politics, ceremony, and spectacle converged. We know from household ordinances and diplomatic reports that the royal rising and royal retiring were semi-public rituals in many courts. The bedchamber, far from being a sealed-off refuge, was sometimes thrown open at the edges of day. Courtiers filed in to watch the king or queen prepare for rest, or to observe the morning routine of prayers, washing, and dressing. In France, this ritual became known as the coucher and lever. In England, similar customs evolved. Imagine it, dozens of eyes upon you as you stretch beneath blankets, attendants bustling to draw curtains while noble petitioners waited their turn to whisper requests. Picture the scene vividly. The bed stands raised on a dais, the canopy heavy with gold embroidery. Courtiers crowd the room, their breath fogging in the cold air. The monarch reclines in state, propped on pillows, perhaps still speaking with ministers about treaties or taxes. Curtains may be half drawn, suggesting both intimacy and authority. To lie in bed before an audience might feel absurd to you, but to them it projected majesty, a body set apart, even in its vulnerability. One fascinating record comes from the French Valois court, where ambassadors noted the strangeness of being received while the king was still in bed. They described the surreal mixture of grandeur and intimacy, being close enough to see the sovereign's nightshirt yet far enough to bow to the embroidered canopy. It was both privilege and intimidation. And then there are the odder details. Some chronicles describe attendants fussing with the royal pillows, deliberately adjusting them in front of visitors to underline how pampered the monarch was. Imagine the irritation. You're trying to fall asleep, but the choreography continues, your attendants transforming your fatigue into spectacle. The irony is sharp royal exhaustion turned into political theatre. Historians remain divided over how monarchs felt about this ritualized exposure. Some argue it enhanced their aura, making them seem distant and divine by blurring the line between public and private. Others believe it was resented, that rulers longed for solitude but accepted ceremony as the cost of power. The lack of consistent testimony keeps the question alive. Were royal beds thrones in disguise or prisons of ritual? Now imagine yourself in that bed, curtains half parted, while courtiers stand in hushed groups. The fire glows dimly, casting golden light on the faces watching you. You sip spiced wine slowly, knowing each gesture will be remembered. You turn your head on the pillow and speak a word to one courtier, granting favor. To another you offer silence, a punishment sharper than steel. Your bed has become a council chamber, a theatre where every sigh and smile matters. The sensory world is layered. The heat of the fire reaches only the front rows, leaving courtiers at the back shivering. The smell of perfume mingles with wool and smoke, heavy in the crowded space. The murmur of whispered flattery hums like bees in the air. The rustle of your bed curtains punctuates the silence, as if the fabric itself were part of the ritual. One amusing anecdote describes a king who, annoyed by courtiers lingering too long, deliberately blew out his candle to signal the end of the ceremony. The chamber plunged into darkness, attendants scrambling, laughter muffled. Even in ritual, monarchs found ways to assert control. Academic debate continues over whether these public bed rituals undermined or reinforced authority. Some scholars argue that exposing the royal body even in nightclothes risked humanizing the monarch too much. Others counter that the very act of allowing such access emphasized control, reminding everyone that proximity was a privilege, not a right. Either interpretation underscores the same truth. The royal bed was a political tool as much as a private refuge. Now step back again into the bed yourself. You lie against cushions while courtiers hover, their faces blurred by candlelight. You speak slowly, deliberately, letting pauses stretch into power. Curtains close at last, shutting out the world. The chamber darkens, but the echoes of voices remain. You drift towards sleep, knowing your body is no longer entirely your own. It belongs to ritual, to image, to history. Morning reverses the process. Curtains open, attendants bow, and courtiers reassemble to witness the monarch's first words of the day. To rise from bed was not merely to wake, but to re-enter the theatre of kingship. Even fatigue became performance, carefully managed and carefully watched. You step back into the corridor, leaving behind the sense of being observed, and you realize medieval kings and queens never truly owned their beds. Even in the freezing winters, those curtains framed not just a body at rest but an